I tried to make a cute little video for you. A fun top 10. Biggest government lies of all time. You know, Iraq WMDs, some Cold War nonsense. Sprinkle in a surveillance scandal and call it a day. And listen to me. That list did not stay cute. It did not stay small. It turned into something much darker and way more organized than I was prepared for. Because here's the thing. We talk about this stuff in the most comforting way possible. You open social media and you see people arguing over one scandal at a time. One thread is melting down over Iraq and they fix the intelligence around the policy. Another is arguing about mass surveillance like it was this shocking one-off that Edward Snowden just stumbled over. Someone else is doom posting about a local corruption case or a health cover-up. And everybody treats their scandal as its own tragic little category of government oopsie. This was a mistake. Bad apples. That administration. You know the script. The community fights for 3 days, posts a few memes. Maybe someone drops a declassified memo from the Gulf of Tonkin or a Tuskegee timeline for the millionth time. And then we move on. New news cycle. New outrage. Reset. Except we need to talk about how much they lied to you, not just that they lied at all. Because the pattern here is not subtle. When the US sells Vietnam on the back of a misrepresented naval attack, and decades later sells Iraq on weapons that do not exist, and in between runs secret programs to spy on you while telling you we only target the bad guys, that's not random static in the storytelling. That is foreshadowing for how the system actually behaves. And I say this as someone who has spent an embarrassing amount of my adult life reading the most boring documents known to man. I am not cool. While normal fans of democracy were touching grass, I was neck-deep in declassified files, commission reports, and whistleblower testimonies, trying to answer one extremely stupid question. Are we crazy for not trusting them? Or were we crazy for ever trusting them at all? Because the way we've been trained to think is very comforting. Each exposed lie is treated as this shocking exception. This is not a sin. This is normal. Calm down. The system corrected itself. A judge scolds someone. A committee writes a report. A government regrets the mistakes of the past. And suddenly the story has a happy little moral. The author of the narrative pats you on the head and tells you it was an isolated failure. But what if that's the real problem? What if the exception is the cover? What if the temporary emergency powers that never end? The economic myths that always somehow protect the same people? The health scandals that get buried under trust the experts? And the surveillance programs that only exist until they're exposed are all parts of one planned structure of deception. I need you to sit with that for a second. Because once you start lining up the lies from wars, from health, from economics, from surveillance, it stops looking random. It stops looking corrupt in the sloppy human way. It starts looking intentional. It starts looking like a playbook you were never meant to see, written by an author who has been running the same story on you your entire life. And in the next part, we're going to start turning those pages one by one. And before we start turning those pages, we need to talk about the word that ruins this entire conversation before it even begins. Conspiracy. Because here's the thing. Conspiracy has been turned into a thought-terminating cliché. You say it, and the room instantly splits into two fandoms. On one side, you've got tinfoil hat speedrunners who think every cloud pattern is a secret NATO sigil. On the other, you've got the respectable citizens who roll their eyes, change the channel, and congratulate themselves for being rational. No one is reading the actual script. They're just booing or cheering the logo on the cover. I need you to see how stupid this binary is. If you question the official story on anything, you get shoved into the same category as the moon is a hologram guy. If you don't question it, you get to be the serious adult who trusts that the author of the national narrative is basically honest, with maybe a few bad plot holes. And the word conspiracy does all the heavy lifting. It takes a documented program with court cases and declassified files and puts it in the same mental folder as lizard royalty. Meanwhile, our community online cherry picks in the worst possible direction. People will write 40 tweet threads about numerology and company logos, but they've never read a single page of the church committee reports. They can recite every rumor about secret tunnels, but they couldn't tell you what the Gulf of Tonkin documents actually say, or how the NSA quietly admitted that the key claims used to escalate Vietnam were false or wildly exaggerated. Tuskegee is a vocabulary word to them, not a 40-year experiment where the government intentionally withheld treatment from black men to watch a disease eat them alive. This is not a sin. Being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast is normal. This is fine. But when fans obsess over the most fringe, zero evidence theories and ignore the boring, well-documented scandals, the scoreboard tilts in a very specific direction. The wild stuff discredits the entire category. The receipts get buried under memes. And that binary, governments are basically honest, versus everything is fake, is not neutral. That binary is the real PSYOP. Because if you pick Team Trust, you never enter the conversation at all. If you pick Team Everything is a Lie, you torch your credibility before you even post the first document. Serious people stay away. Institutions get to point at the worst threads and say, "See? That's what conspiracy people are." The author of the story keeps writing. So listen to me. This video is a third path. Not trust the government. Not trust every rumor. Trust receipts. Trust documents, hearings, declassifications, whistleblower testimony, verifiable timelines. Trust the boring PDFs no one shares because they don't have spooky music behind them. By the end of this, you're going to be able to tell the difference between a wild theory and a confirmed lie. The same way you can tell real foreshadowing from coincidence and good storytelling. And once you can sort those into separate piles, you'll see something worse than any single scandal. A repeatable pattern. A planned pattern. And in the next section, we're going to start with war, because that's where the pattern stops being abstract and starts getting people killed. So yes, this is a 2-hour plus video. I can already hear your brain going, 2 hours for lies. Listen to me. If governments can spend 50, 60, 100 years maintaining one fake story about a war, you can spend one evening actually looking at what they said, what they did, and what they later had to quietly admit under oath was nonsense. Here's the thing. This is not just a compilation of scandals. This is not a top 10 gotcha countdown so you can feel smug and then go back to doom scrolling. The core thesis is that when you line up the major, documented lies across war, surveillance, health, and economics, you do not get random chaos. You get a recognizable strategy, a planned pattern for controlling what you think is possible, what you think is inevitable, and what you think is your fault. So structurally, we need to do 3 big things, in order, or this just turns into conspiracy soup. First, I'm going to build a framework. Categories. Different species of lie and manipulation. The "we never did that" denial. The "we did it for your safety" justification. The "it was a mistake, stop asking questions" cleanup. Think of it as learning the foreshadowing rules of state power. What gets hinted? What gets hidden? What gets retrofitted after the fact? Second, we walk through case studies, actual documented examples. Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, where later NSA documents admit the incident used to escalate Vietnam was misrepresented. The Iraq WMD narrative, where intelligence was fixed around the policy. The Tuskegee syphilis study, where an entire community was experimented on while officials smiled for the camera. Snowden's leaks showing PRISM and X-Keyscore vacuuming up data while leaders swore they were not spying on you. I need you to see the receipts, not just the vibes. Third, we stitch those into a modern playbook, not a vibe chart, a step-by-step script that is still being used right now in your feed. When a new temporary measure somehow becomes permanent, you will already have seen that move 3 times in the past. When "trust the experts" suddenly means do not ask about the funding, the patents, or the gag orders, you will recognize the genre of storytelling they are running on you. To keep this from turning into pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast territory, the scope is narrow and mean. Declassified files, official inquiries, whistleblower leaks, court settlements. We are not doing unprovable speculation. This is not a sin. This is normal fan theory brain, but it is a terrible method for understanding power. So this is fine. We stick to what we can point at. Because if you do not understand the categories and the patterns, you are stuck reacting emotionally to every new scandal. Outrage, burnout, repeat. But once you know the script, you can see the foreshadowing of the next lie in real time. And in the next section, when we start with war, you are going to watch that script run from page 1. So we need to stop doom-scrolling scandals and actually name the structure. Because once you see the structure, you stop being surprised and you start predicting. And listen to me, the pattern is embarrassingly consistent. Here's the thing. Almost every government lie you can point to falls into one of 3 categories. First, manufactured narratives. The big glossy stories about who we are and what we are doing. Second, operational cover-ups. The specific denials about concrete programs, events, and crimes. Third, narrative retrofits. The cleanup operation where they rewrite the past so the institutions still look wise and necessary. That's the whole playbook. Poster, script change, commentary track. Manufactured narratives are the movie poster. They're the tagline on the front of the theatre. We're spreading democracy. We're protecting you from terror. The economy is fundamentally sound. These are not random PR lines. They're long-term storylines that justify entire policy arcs, war budgets, surveillance laws, austerity measures, all hanging off a few emotionally sticky sentences. In storytelling terms, it's the genre declaration. This is an inspiring war drama, not a resource grab. This is a tense thriller about security, not a slow creep into a panopticon. Take war. For Vietnam, the poster was stopping communism and responding to unprovoked aggression. For Iraq, it was WMDS and mushroom clouds. For the war on terror, it was they hate our freedom. Same underlying move. Sell you a heroic narrative so you'll accept costs you'd reject if the logline said, "We're gambling thousands of lives on bad intel and geopolitical ego." The community conversation gets trapped, arguing over casting choices, while the studio already locked the genre. Operational cover-ups are different. This is the hidden script rewrite mid-production. These are the concrete, falsifiable claims. We don't spy on citizens without warrants. There was an unprovoked attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. There's no secret testing program on civilians. This is where the author of the state is doing very intentional writing, because now they're not selling vibes, they're dodging evidence. Snowden pulls back the curtain, and suddenly you see PRISM, X-key score, mass collection at scale that officials swore under oath wasn't happening. Declassified NSA documents admit key Gulf of Tonkin claims were false or exaggerated. Tuskegee reveals men being denied treatment, while press releases talk about public health. These aren't vague misunderstandings. These are line edits to reality. Then, when the poster is torn and the script leaks, you get narrative retrofits. This is the director's commentary pretending it was all planned. Intelligence failure. We were misled too. We couldn't have known. They don't say, we lied. They say, the story was always about the tragic fog of war. Retrofitting is when they take the exposed mess and reframe it as a noble stumble. This is not a sin unique to governments. Authors do it. Fans do it. Your brain does it every time it protects your ego. This is normal. But when states do it, the goal is to preserve legitimacy so the next poster still works. I need you to hold these three categories in your head, because from here on, every example we touch, starting with war in the next section, you're going to be able to say on the spot, poster, script, or commentary. And once you can do that, the foreshadowing of the next lie stops being invisible. So once you can say poster, script, or commentary, here's the thing. You also have to admit that perfect honesty from governments is a fantasy, not a goal we're slowly marching toward. A structural contradiction baked into the system from day one. On paper, the job description is simple. Serve the public, protect rights, tell the truth so citizens can make informed decisions. In practice, the same people are also trying to win elections, avoid blame, keep donors happy, and make sure the institution doesn't collapse on their watch. That's a built-in conflict of interest. You don't need a conspiracy when the incentives are already pointing in two opposite directions. So when a war goes wrong, or an economic policy backfires, or some secret program leaks, what wins? The noble poster that says, "We are accountable to you," or the survival script that says, "If this scandal explodes, we lose power for a decade." I need you to be honest here. If your career, your party, and your entire foreign policy agenda hinge on maintaining one specific story, how tempting is it to nudge reality, to clarify, to delay the inconvenient part until after the election? And then you add information asymmetry on top. They have the raw feed, classified cables, intercepted calls, internal memos. You get the edited trailer, the press conference, the talking points, the one chart on the evening news. You're watching the highlight reel of a game you weren't allowed to attend. When the NSA quietly rolls out global surveillance programs, you don't see PRISM or X-key score. You see a vague line about modernizing intelligence capabilities, and you clap because the poster said safety. This is where national security becomes the magic phrase. Say those two words and entire categories of scrutiny just shut down. War plans, drone strike errors, covert operations, economic pressure campaigns, even embarrassing historical files about torture in Kenya or the Gulf of Tonkin misrepresentations. Into the vault they go. Courts defer, journalists hit a wall, and if you question it too hard, you're told you're helping the enemy. This is not a sin unique to one country. This is normal for modern states. Now put yourself in the chair of an official for a second. Your boss wants a specific narrative on Iraq's WMDs. Your allies are already on board. The community of intelligence analysts is split, but the memo on your desk says the policy is decided. The evidence will be arranged around it. Careers, treaties, military deployments, billions in contracts. Those are the stakes. In that context, raw honesty is not the safe option. It's the career suicide option. Once you see those incentives, the pattern changes. Individual lies stop looking like random moral failures and start reading as foreshadowing, as planned beats in a larger storytelling engine whose main genre is regime stability. This is fine from the system's perspective. The system is getting exactly what it was built to get. But for you, for us, for the fans of this myth called democracy, it means something darker. The examples we're about to walk through, war, surveillance, economics, health, aren't outliers. They're the logical outcome. And when we start with war in the next section, you're going to see the poster, the script, and the commentary collide so hard that the official story doesn't just crack, it detonates. So when I say war is the poster, here's the thing. There's a whole story machine sitting behind that poster, and it doesn't run on tanks. It runs on consent. Not the honest kind where you actually know what you're signing. The manufactured kind where you wake up one day absolutely certain this new policy is your own idea. Manufacturing consent is the opposite of a dictator pointing a gun at your head. It's the author handing you a script and convincing you that you wrote it. No brute force, no cartoon villain. Just storytelling so constant, so repetitive, that resisting it feels weird, antisocial, almost insane. You don't have to be chained if you're already convinced the cell is for your safety. And the way they do that is embarrassingly simple. Every manufactured narrative has three pieces. First, a clean moral frame. Good versus evil. Order versus chaos. The free world versus the enemy. Second, a vague but urgent threat. Not specific enough to verify, but scary enough that you don't want to be wrong about it. Third, a heroic role for the government or the military. They are the protagonist. You are the anxious audience, applauding from the dark. Cold War domino theory is the textbook example. The story wasn't "we want influence in Vietnam." The story was, if one country falls to communism, they all fall, and then freedom itself dies. Simple moral frame, free versus communist. Vague but urgent threat. A whole region tipping over in some geopolitical Jenga game. Heroic role. Only decisive intervention can save the day. Suddenly, an incredibly messy, intentional power play turns into a neat little piece of foreshadowing about the end of civilization. Fast forward to the War on Terror. Same category, updated branding. Moral frame, civilization versus barbarism. Threat, shadowy networks everywhere and nowhere forever. Heroic role, endless conflict abroad, and endless security expansions at home. Fans of this franchise were told that warrantless surveillance, secret kill lists, and enhanced interrogation were tragic but necessary plot beats. Not torture, not mass spying, just upgraded vocabulary. Then you get the economic spin-off. Too big to fail. Moral frame, Responsible adults versus a looming financial apocalypse. Threat. If these specific institutions go down, you lose your job, your house, your future. Heroic role. Technocrats stepping in with quantitative easing and bailouts. Notice the writing. Not, we're socializing private losses for our friends. A neutral, almost sci-fi term that sounds intentional, planned, unavoidable. And this is where the story machine really flexes. PR teams, speechwriters, friendly media outlets. This whole community of narrative engineers repeat the same phrases until they stop sounding authored and start sounding natural. Collateral damage. Temporary emergency measure. For your safety. You hear them so often they become common sense. This is not a sin in storytelling. This is normal in propaganda. Pattern interrupt. Ask yourself, when was the last time a temporary measure actually expired on schedule? I need you to sit with that. Because once you see the machinery, once you understand that these phrases are foreshadowing for policies that never leave, you will never hear those words the same way again. And when we zoom into a single war in the next section, you're going to watch that narrative template applied shot for shot until the official plot and the classified script completely diverge. So here's where it gets worse. Up to now, we've been talking about big, obvious narratives. Freedom, security, temporary emergencies that mysteriously never retire. But listen to me. The real engine of the machine isn't the capital L lie. It's the quiet, technically correct sentence that leaves you with the totally wrong movie playing in your head. Half-truths are the preferred weapon. Not because officials are bad at lying, but because they're very good at lawyering. A half-truth is a statement that is literally accurate in some narrow, surgically defined category, but intentionally framed so that you, the audience, walk away believing something that is functionally false. The words are clean. The implication is dirty. That difference is the whole game. Take, we do not torture. You've heard that one. Strong, moral, absolute. Except then you find the memo where torture gets redefined into a Sudoku puzzle of pain thresholds and time limits, so that waterboarding, stress positions, and sleep deprivation somehow fall outside the new definition. The author of that memo isn't doing storytelling. He's doing dark world foreshadowing. He's planting language that will later be used as a shield. We said we did not torture. And according to our custom-built dictionary, that was true. Same pattern with, we do not collect the content of communications. Fans of surveillance policy heard that and relaxed. Content? Safe. Except content was reinterpreted so metadata, who you called, when, how often, from where, didn't count. Prism and X-keyscore vacuum everything short of the literal words, and suddenly the government can say with a straight face that they're not reading your emails while holding a 4K map of your entire social life. This is not a sin in their world. This is normal. This is fine. Or flip it around with weapons of mass destruction. Inspectors say there are no active WMD programs at the moment. Careful, constrained, present tense. Then that phrase gets inverted in the sales pitch for war. Absence of proof becomes proof of cunning concealment. The original statement was cautious. The remix turns it into a drumbeat of inevitability. Here's the thing. None of this happens by accident. Lawyers and intelligence officials sit in rooms and workshop verbs the way a good author workshops plot twists. Every, to the best of our knowledge, and, at the time, based on the information we had, is pre-written plausible deniability. When the documents declassify and the story collapses, they can retreat to that one adverb they buried in sentence 3 and insist the foreshadowing was there all along. And the stagecraft helps. Press briefings and hearings are built to kill follow-up questions. You get a wall of jargon, collection modalities, enhanced techniques, kinetic operations, and the moment a question gets too precise, it hits the force field of classification. I need you to notice how often the answer is, "I can't discuss that in this setting," and how rarely anyone is allowed to ask, "Okay, then what did you actually mean by that sentence?" Which brings us to the case study. One war, one televised line. A single carefully worded sentence that seemed modest and responsible in the moment and turned out to be the hinge for years of blood and money. In the next section, we're going to slow that clip down frame by frame and watch how a half-truth, repeated often enough, became the official reality, until the memos and tapes dragged the classified script into the light. So here's where it gets nastier. The most dangerous lie in that war clip isn't the first statement on TV. It's the second and third versions that show up years later, wearing glasses and a blazer, calmly explaining that mistakes were made. That's the real weapon, the retrofit. Listen to me, because this is where a lot of the conspiracy community actually undershoot the problem. We imagine one big capital L lie, and then a heroic reveal where the documents drop. The whistleblower speaks, and the truth wins. But governments don't treat exposure as defeat. They treat it as an editing note. Oh, that draft leaked. No problem. We'll punch up the script. Here's the thing. There's a sequence. Step 1 is denial. Total confident. That never happened. And how dare you suggest it? Energy. Gulf of Tonkin? Unprovoked attack. Mass surveillance? We do not spy on our own citizens. Tuskegee? Treatment is being provided. Full stop. The author of reality is telling you the chapter heading, and you're supposed to accept it. Step 2 is the partial admission. Not because they suddenly found morality, but because the evidence crossed a threshold and the PR people started sweating. Now you get phrases engineered in a lab to sound responsible while admitting nothing intentional. Intelligence failures. We were misled by bad actors. Mistakes were made. Notice the passive voice. Notice how the subject of the sentence quietly vanishes. Who made the mistake? The fog of war, apparently. Step 3 is the final narrative retrofit. This is the serious documentary, the official commission, the 600-page report that confirms the horror while amputating the motive. The Iraq WMD story is textbook. The inquiry admits there were no stockpiles, that intel was fixed around the policy, but the framing is systemic failure, not deliberate deception. The problem wasn't that they lied, the problem was that processes broke down. This is not a sin in their category system. This is normal. This is fine. And when a government finally pays compensation or issues an apology, notice how the story gets filed. The Mau Mau torture in Kenya. For decades, London said it was exaggerated or isolated. Then the secret colonial files surfaced. They paid out, and the official line became, "A dark chapter, regrettable abuses, not reflective of our values." The wrongdoing is confirmed, but the intent is retrofitted into a tragic accident of history, not a planned policy. Here's where it gets really insidious for storytelling. The retrofit version is what makes it into textbooks, anniversary speeches, and balanced school documentaries. Future students don't see the raw lie and the leaked memo side by side. They just see the polished third draft, where everybody was acting in good faith and got a few things wrong under pressure. The foreshadowing of the real scandal disappears. The only thing left is the cleaned-up arc. I need you to realize what that means for memory. You and I might remember the denial. Your kids will only ever meet the retrofit. And in a second, we're going to do the thing you're not supposed to do. We'll line the original quotes, the leaked documents, and the final official story up next to each other so you can literally watch the lie mutate in real time and see what they're still trying to hide. And this is where your brain probably rebels. You hear all this and go, okay, but there's no way all these presidents and CEOs are sitting in a Bond villain lair, smoking cigars and foreshadowing the next 100 years of propaganda. And listen to me, I agree with you. That cartoon version, the round table of evil, mostly fantasy. Here's the thing. You don't need a single mastermind when you have shared incentives. Politicians want to avoid panic and blame so they can win the next election. Agencies want bigger budgets and more power. Corporations want stable markets and no one asking annoying questions about externalities or war profits. Media wants access, ratings, and not getting cut off from official sources. You don't need a secret meeting when everyone at the table is already graded on the same test. Think about war. The Gulf of Tonkin story gets massaged into unprovoked attack. Iraq gets sold on WMDs that never show up, and somehow the headlines all rhyme. Did every editor and minister sign the same blood oath, or did they all respond to the same pressure? Don't be the one who looks unpatriotic. Don't be the outlet that undermines the troops. Don't be the minister who admits the evidence is thin. Now, how do the actual lines get synchronized? This is where it stops being mysterious and starts being boring. Memos leak all the time. Here are today's talking points. Parties whip their members on message. Press offices send pre-written quotes and graphics. Think tanks spit out glossy PDFs with perfectly tested phrases, and suddenly every panel, show and op-ed is using the same three-word spell. National security threat. Temporary emergency measure. Isolated incident. You've seen this movie. And then there's career risk. I need you to really sit with this, because this is where the coordination actually lives. Inside a ministry, a newsroom, a lab, you learn fast which truths get you promoted and which truths get you quietly disinvited from meetings. The whistleblower gets audited. The cautious team player gets tenure. The editor who spikes the uncomfortable surveillance story becomes reliable. The reporter who pushes on Prism or X-Keyscore too hard becomes difficult. No one has to say, "We are lying now." The system just trains you. Pattern interrupt. Imagine you're the one honest person in that room. You raise your hand and say, "Hey, this trust the experts line is doing a lot of work for data we haven't actually seen." Do you get a medal for intellectual courage, or do you get parked on a dead-end assignment until you take the hint? This is not a sin of individual villainy. This is normal institutional behavior. This is fine from the system's point of view. The problem is that it produces something that looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from deliberate top-down coordination. And that's the pattern we need to map. Not a single author writing a conspiracy, but a sprawling, improvisational story where every character is rewarded for trimming the truth in the same direction. In the next section, I'm going to show you exactly how that story travels, from classified memo to press conference to your group chat, without anyone ever having to say the word plot. And nowhere does that no one said plot energy hit harder than war. Because if you're a government in 1964 and you want to turn a messy, low-visibility conflict in Vietnam into a full-on televised apocalypse, you can't just walk out and say, we're escalating because vibes. You need a clean story, a headline, a villain. So quick context pass so we're on the same page. Before 1964, the US was already in Vietnam, but in the shadows. Advisors, covert operations, money, weapons, the usual "we're not technically at war" package. Domestically, there was hesitation. Voters were not lining up to send their kids to die in a jungle for a French colonial mess. The author of the official narrative needed a casus belli, something simple enough to fit in a news anchor's intro. Enter the Gulf of Tonkin. The official story you would have heard in August '64 is very neat. 2 separate attacks on US destroyers, the Maddox and then the Maddox plus the Turner Joy, in international waters. Unprovoked aggression by North Vietnam. Brave American sailors under fire. Radar blips. Torpedoes in the water. Urgent radio calls. It's practically storyboarded for you. The foreshadowing here is obvious. They hit us. We have to hit back harder. Congress is handed this script and within days passes the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, a blank check for the president to use all necessary measures in Southeast Asia. Not a formal declaration of war, but functionally the same. This is where you and I need to pause and stare, because that one vote is the hinge that swings open the door to a quagmire. Now fast forward a few decades. Declassified NSA documents, internal cables, historians going frame by frame over the evidence. And the second attack? The dramatic escalatory one? Probably never happened. Sonar ghosts, misread radar, panicked reports in bad weather, then massaged on the way up the chain. Intelligence that did not support a clear attack was trimmed, edited, and presented to Congress as if it were solid. Here's the thing. That's not a tiny error. That is the core event the whole narrative hangs on. We need to pull this apart in 3 layers, because the community tends to compress it into one vague, they lied. First layer, the operational lie. What actually happened in the water was ambiguous at best, and officials spoke as if it were crystal clear. Second layer, the heroic framing. This was sold as defending freedom, protecting democracy, stopping the dominoes from falling, when the underlying strategy was about credibility, containment, and not losing face. Third layer, the retrofit. Years later, the story gets softened into intelligence failures and fog of war, as if this was an unfortunate oopsie and not an intentional narrowing of inconvenient facts. And the cost of that narrative choice? Not just bad polling. We're talking millions of Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian lives, tens of thousands of American dead, entire regions carpet-bombed into long-term destabilization. A generation with PTSD and Agent Orange in their bloodstream. All hanging from a story beat that would not survive a decent fact check. This is not a sin unique to one administration. This is normal in the worst possible sense. Tonkin becomes the template. Ambiguous incident, overconfident briefing, sweeping war powers. You see the foreshadowing for Iraq yet? Or do I need to draw the storyboard? Because in the next section, I'm going to show you how that Tonkin playbook gets upgraded for the 24-hour news cycle, where the incident doesn't even need to be real-time gunfire. It can be a satellite photo, a lab leak rumor, a single word in a classified memo that you're never allowed to read. So, fast forward from Tonkin's fuzzy sonar blips to 2002, where the incident isn't a patrol boat, it's a PowerPoint. The threat isn't a skirmish in a bay, it's a hypothetical mushroom cloud over an American city. And I need you to notice how familiar the storytelling feels. Here's the thing. The Iraq WMD narrative was sold as a ticking clock thriller. We were told Saddam had active chemical, biological, maybe even nuclear programs. We were shown grainy satellite photos of suspicious facilities, warned about weapons of mass destruction that could be deployed in 45 minutes, and hammered with that line, "We can't wait for the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud." That's not intel, that's script writing. Then came the props. Mobile weapons labs supposedly roving the desert, brewing anthrax on wheels. Aluminum tubes that we were assured could only be for nuclear centrifuges. A British dossier whispering about uranium from Niger, backed by documents that turned out to be embarrassingly forged. And behind all of that, a mountain of cherry-picked intelligence where any analyst saying this is uncertain quietly vanished from the presentation deck. On paper, that's evidence. In practice, it's foreshadowing for a war the author already decided to write. The mobile labs later turned out to be weather balloon facilities. The aluminum tubes? Experts inside the government were already yelling that they were more suitable for conventional rockets. The Niger uranium story collapsed so hard it became a meme in the intel community. Post-war inspections and official reports found no active stockpiles, no imminent threat, and a paper trail showing that caveats were stripped out until "we're not sure" became "we know." And then you get that infamous phrase from the Downing Street memo, the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy, not informing the policy, not guiding the policy, fixed around it. That's the difference between investigation and adaptation, between we're discovering the story and we're retrofitting reality to match the ending we already picked. Now compare that to Tonkin. In both cases, you start with ambiguous or weak signals, a murky naval encounter, sketchy reports of WMD programs. You inflate them into a clear existential threat. You sideline dissenting voices, whether it's NSA analysts saying the Tonkin intercepts don't prove an attack, or weapons inspectors in Iraq saying, "Hey, we're not finding what you're claiming on TV," and when it all falls apart, the community gets the same shrug. Sorry, bad intel, honest mistake, who could have known? Except, this is not a sin of random incompetence. This is normal for a system that keeps producing the same narrative beats. Tonkin, Iraq, different decades, same three-act structure. At what point do we stop calling it a mistake and start calling it a method? And if this is the war script, I need you to ask, what happens when they start using the same structure for enemies that aren't even countries anymore? Because in the next section, we're going to talk about the sequel, how that playbook gets ported from battlefields to threats you can't see, can't vote against, and can't ever really defeat. So when you hear all that and think, okay, but surely they wouldn't straight up script fake attacks in advance, I need you to pause, because they did, on paper, with letterheads. Operation Northwoods is the moment the mask slips in 12-point Times New Roman. Early 1960s, Cold War peak, the US military's Joint Chiefs of Staff draft a plan to justify an invasion of Cuba. Not with evidence, with theatre. The entire thing is basically a storyboard for a horror movie where the government is both the screenwriter and the jump scare. Here's the thing. This wasn't some fringe fanfic written by a bored colonel. These were formal proposals, signed, stamped, routed up the chain. They planned staged or provoked attacks on US assets and then to blame Cuba. A remember the main speedrun, but this time with memos. They floated the idea of faking the shooting down of a civilian airliner. Not what if Cuba does this, but what if we make it look Cuba did this? Swap a plane, land the passengers secretly, blow up a drone in the sky, flood the news with grieving families and righteous fury. That's not me being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. That's in the declassified text. They talked about staging hijackings too, real or simulated, as long as the story landed. Ship attacks, bombings in Miami or DC, orchestrated sabotage on military bases. Then, plant fabricated evidence to prove Havana's guilt. The writing reads less governmental and more, what if we speedrun manufacturing consent in under 30 minutes? No glitches. And again, this is not rumor. This is not a forum thread. This is official US documentation that sat in a safe until it was declassified decades later. The president at the time, Kennedy, rejected it. The operation never ran. But we need to be very clear about the category of sin here. The problem isn't only what they did. The problem is what they were absolutely willing to do. Because once you've had senior planners calmly suggesting in writing, we could kill people from our own country and blame someone else, the entire conversation about no government would ever do that is over. Foreshadowing stops being a metaphor and starts being a literal policy draft. Listen to me. The fact Northwood stayed in the drawer does not make it reassuring. It makes it evidence. It proves manufacturing a pretext for war is not a wild conspiracy theory. It's a known, intentional option on the menu. This is normal in their planning culture. This is fine in their brainstorming sessions. And here's the pattern interrupt I need you to sit with. If this is what survived the edit, got typed, formatted and archived, what didn't? If this is the rough draft we're allowed to read, what does that say about the mindset behind the operations that never got names, never got declassified, and never had a tidy PDF for historians to quote? Because in the next section, we're going to stop staring at this one cursed script page and zoom out to the whole bookshelf. From Northwoods to Tonkin to WMDs, and how we need to protect you keeps turning into we planned this ending long before you saw the first scene. So when you zoom out from Northwoods to Tonkin to WMDs, there's this one line that keeps getting repeated in the background track. Trust us. We're the adults in the room. And nowhere did they sell that harder than on surveillance. Because if you're going to run a long, messy story full of plot holes, you need to control the narration. For years, the official script was soothing, surgical. We only target bad guys. Everything is lawful. We are not spying on ordinary citizens. Over and over, from podiums, in hearings, in those dead-eyed Sunday show interviews where everyone pretends they're in a serious drama and not a PR reel. The community of respectable experts would nod along and tell you the same thing. It's targeted, it's minimized, it's all under strict oversight. This is fine. This is normal. Except here's the thing. In 2013, Edward Snowden drops the folder from hell, and suddenly we find out the author had been drafting a very different story off-screen. Prism. Direct access to data from major tech companies. X-Keyscore. Search almost anything you've ever done on the internet. Upstream collection. Vacuuming traffic straight off the backbone of the web. This wasn't a sniper rifle. This was a fishing trawler dragging the entire ocean, then assuring the fish, no, we only caught the bad ones. Remember James Clapper in 2013? Senate hearing, very calm, very authoritative. He's asked if the NSA collects any type of data at all on millions of Americans. He says, "No, sir, not wittingly." That's the clip the fans of the system point to as proof of oversight. Then you open the leaked slides and see slogans like "collect it all," "process it all," "exploit it all." The internal PowerPoint is bragging about binge-watching the whole planet, while the public script insists they barely glance at anyone. So how do you say that on camera without going to jail? You cheat on the definitions. You redefine collect. So it doesn't mean when we copy your data into our servers, it means when some analyst opens it in a query window. Until a human stares at it, it's Schrödinger's surveillance. It both is and is not collected. You twist target so that if you point the hose at one foreigner, every American standing next to them in the data stream somehow doesn't count. I need you to see the foreshadowing here. This is the same storytelling trick as every other lie. They build a tiny legal safe room inside a giant moral crime scene. On paper, they can say, "We do not wittingly collect," and the lawyers clap because within their private dictionary, the line is technically true. In the real world, your calls, your emails, your browsing history are sitting in a database a bored contractor can query on a Tuesday. And when Snowden blows the doors off and the denial script finally collapses, the narrative does a hard genre switch overnight. We go from "we don't do this" to "okay, we do this, but we had to keep you safe." No apology arc, no accountability subplot. Just a retrofitted justification pasted over a decade of gaslighting. Listen to me. We need to talk about that pivot, because it's the same move they use on war, on health, on the economy. In the next section, we're going to watch that we never quietly become "we always had to," and how fear turns every temporary exception into a permanent feature of the story you live in. So when that "we never" quietly mutates into "we always had to," surveillance is where the mutation turns into body horror. Because here's the thing. They didn't just lie about what they were doing. They rewrote the dictionary so the lie could technically be true. The core semantic trick is almost elegant in a sociopathic way. Intelligence agencies told Congress, told courts, told you, "We don't collect data on Americans without a warrant." Statement. Very firm, very reassuring. Then, in secret memos, they define collect as a human analyst has queried and viewed this specific record. So the moment the data hits their servers, that's not collection. Storing it in giant databases, still not collection. It only becomes real the second a human opens the file. I need you to sit with the absurdity there. If I break into your house and copy your entire hard drive, but I promise I won't click any folders until later, in their legal fanfic I haven't collected anything yet. I'm just a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast and also happens to be holding your entire digital life on a USB stick. This is not a sin, they insist. This is fine. This is normal. That one definitional pivot let officials look Congress in the eye and say, "On the record, we are not collecting on millions of citizens," while the physical machines in Utah and elsewhere were inhaling phone metadata, emails, browsing histories in bulk. The problem isn't just the hypocrisy, it's the foreshadowing. Once you accept that words can be hollowed out like that, Every future denial already has an escape hatch pre-written. And to make it stick, they didn't just twist vocabulary. They built a secret parallel legal system to bless it. The FISA court, which on paper is supposed to be a judge-checking executive power, ends up issuing classified opinions that reinterpret public law so aggressively they might as well be amendments. You get this hidden constitution for surveillance where relevant to an investigation somehow means everyone, all the time. But you're not allowed to read the reasoning because national security. So when Snowden drops the receipts in 2013, the narrative doesn't collapse. It retrofits. Overnight, the script flips from "we don't do bulk collection" to "we do this," but with robust safeguards and oversight. Denial becomes responsible management. Critics go from paranoid cranks to naive about the threats we face, and the community is gently scolded for not understanding how hard the job is. The author didn't change the story. They just revealed that the twist was planned all along. Trust us. Listen to me. That move is the pattern. First, total denial. Then, exposed. Then. Actually, this was intentional, necessary, and mature grown-ups have always known about it. The Overton window slides from unthinkable to maybe uncomfortable to shrug. That's just how modern life works, before you've even finished doom-scrolling the first headline. And if you think that word game only lives in the spy world, wait until you see what they did to the word temporary. Because temporary doesn't mean short, it means will stop once it's no longer useful. And here's the thing. Governments eventually realized they didn't even have to build half this stuff themselves. Why spend decades constructing a perfect panopticon when the private sector will do it for you and call it frictionless user experience? Why fight to bug everyone's house when you can just let fans camp outside Apple stores for the privilege of buying the microphone? Listen to me. You were never just the citizen. You were the product demo. Once smartphones, social networks, and cloud everything took off, the state had this light bulb moment. Wait, there's an entire parallel surveillance system here, meticulously planned, obsessively optimized, and people are voluntarily feeding it with their feelings, their location, their late-night searches for how to tell if I'm burned out. This is not a sin. This is not some cartoon villain twist in the writing. This is normal corporate behavior scaled up to empire level. So they start piggybacking. PRISM, the program Snowden exposed, wasn't the NSA installing cameras in every living room. It was the NSA tapping into data streams from companies that were already hoovering up your messages, contacts, and metadata because the community needs better recommendations. The world government doesn't have to foreshadow anything when your apps are live blogging your inner life in real time. And when they want more, they don't kick down the door first. They send legal requests, national security letters, secret court orders, or they go for voluntary cooperation, that magical category where a platform says, "We care deeply about your privacy," and then quietly hands over a fire hose of non-content data because technically they didn't read your DMs, they just mapped your entire social graph. You know that wall of text you scroll past and hit "I agree" on because you want to get back to watching a video about foreshadowing in One Piece? That's the script. That's the corporate half-truth. The author of that terms of service is intentionally vague where it matters. We may share information with trusted partners for security purposes. Security for whom? From what? For how long? Those clauses become legal scaffolding the state can grab whenever it needs to retrofit a justification for one more data grab. And then there's the revolving door. Officials go from intelligence agencies to senior roles at major platforms and back again. 1 year they're overseeing bulk collection. Next year they're head of trust and safety, writing the rules for what gets stored, flagged, or forwarded. This is fine, we're told. This is expertise. But incentives start to rhyme. Data becomes the answer to every problem. More collection, more retention, more proactive detection. Pattern interrupt. At this point, you might want to believe there's some higher referee, some watchdog in the sky making sure neither side goes too far. I need you to sit with this question instead. If both your government and your apps are tracking you, and both are financially, politically, and reputationally incentivized to downplay it, who exactly is supposed to be the watchdog? So when both sides of the surveillance machine are grading their own homework, who's left to tell you the truth? Historically, the answer has been, trust the experts. White coat, serious voice, a couple charts, and suddenly the debate is over. And here's the thing. Expertise is real. You actually do want the person cutting you open to have passed more than a BuzzFeed quiz. But we need to hold two ideas in our head at once. 1. Some people genuinely know more than you and me, and that's good. 2. The phrase, trust the experts, has been weaponized so many times that hearing it uncritically is the epistemic equivalent of clicking on a pop-up that says, congrats, you won. This is normal. This is not a sin. Institutions will always try to wrap power in the language of safety. Enter Tuskegee. If there's a final boss of public health betrayal, this is it. Starting in 1932, U.S. Public Health Service officials enrolled hundreds of poor black men in Alabama into a study of bad blood. Free exams, free meals, free burial insurance. It was sold as a kindness. What they did not say was the quiet part. The men had syphilis, and the whole point was to watch what happened if you never treated it. Listen to me. By the 1940s, penicillin was a known, effective cure. Not a theory, not a maybe, a cure. Doctors used it for other patients. They wrote papers about its success. And the men in Tuskegee, they were deliberately kept in the dark, denied treatment, even blocked from getting penicillin elsewhere. Officials literally sent letters to local draft boards to stop participants from being cured during military checkups because that would contaminate the data. Publicly, the story stayed tidy. This was framed as free healthcare, a benevolent government program helping an underserved community. Privately, internal memos show researchers discussing the men as data points, not patients. The expert consensus around the study wasn't some neutral, objective truth. It was a club of people who had already decided the outcome and then wrapped it in jargon so no one asked too many questions. And Tuskegee is not some glitch in an otherwise pristine record. You can run this pattern in other countries and you keep hitting the same wall. Forced sterilizations signed off by eugenics boards and medical societies. Contaminated blood scandals where officials insisted supplies were safe long after they had evidence of HIV or hepatitis. Secret radiation experiments where civilians were dosed without informed consent, then reassured that everything was within acceptable limits, a category they had quietly defined themselves. The foreshadowing here is brutal. Once you see this template, later debates about public health read very differently. I need you to notice how often that phrase shows up right when someone needs you to stop asking questions. Sometimes it names genuine life-saving work. Sometimes it's a PR skin suit stretched over something predatory. And from the outside, in real time, the difference is not obvious. So when a government says, "Trust the experts," the correct response is not automatic obedience or automatic rejection. It's, which experts, chosen by whom, with what incentives, and who's allowed to disagree without being erased? Hold that thought, because the next category of lies is where "for your safety" starts funding actual wars. So when a government says, "for your safety," and then starts a war, you expect the horror to be offshore, on some battlefield map. Tuskegee is what happens when that logic comes home and sets up shop in your neighbour's bloodstream. From 1932 to 1972, 4 decades, this thing just kept going. Different presidents, different CDC directors, different medical fashions, penicillin going from miracle drug to background noise. Administrations changed, leadership rotated, memos got new letterheads. The study stayed. No heroic insider ripped the cord. No committee suddenly stood up and said, "Wait, are we the villains?" It was institutional cruise control, except the road was human beings. Here's the thing. They didn't think they were cartoon villains. Inside the machine, they had a whole vocabulary to make it sound rational, even noble. Scientifically important. Unique population. Natural history of untreated syphilis. You hear those phrases in a meeting, you don't picture men being told they have bad blood while treatment is quietly withheld. You picture a serious author doing very important storytelling in the grand narrative of medical progress. This is not a sin in their heads. This is normal. That's how groupthink sustains abuse. You wrap the horror in technical language until it feels clean. You downgrade human suffering into a data category. And once it's in a category, you can file it. You can budget for it. You can renew it each year with a signature that takes less effort than ordering office chairs. Nobody has to twirl a mustache. They just have to not ask the next question. It took someone breaking that spell. A public health worker, Peter Buxton, kept raising concerns inside the system and getting brushed off with the same scientifically important script. So he went outside. He leaked to a reporter. In 1972, the Associated Press story hits. And suddenly the experiment is not an abstract study. It's a front-page example of the government using black men as lab rats while pretending to provide care. Fans of the official narrative had to confront the director's cut. The outrage was immediate. Hearings, lawsuits, headlines. And then the retrofit began. Commissions were formed, reports were written, new ethical guidelines and review boards were rolled out. Eventually, in 1997, Clinton gives a formal apology. On paper, this is accountability. This is fine. But listen to me. Notice the framing. Tuskegee gets packaged as a tragic aberration, a one-off moral failure from a more ignorant era, not a window into systemic attitudes about race, power, and expendable bodies. That retrofit is a storytelling move. The author is the state, and the state desperately needs you to read this as a closed arc with a neat moral, not foreshadowing for anything still running under new names. Because if it's an aberration, you can heal with an apology. If it's a pattern, you have a structural problem. So when communities harmed by this here trust the system, their skepticism isn't conspiracy brain. It's learned survival. You watch your grandparents used as data points for 40 years. You don't forget. You don't just swallow the next "for your safety" campaign. And if you're thinking, okay, but surely they wouldn't weaponize that trust on a global scale again, we need to talk about what happens when the same narrative tools get pointed at entire countries instead of one town in Alabama. Because when you zoom out from one town in Alabama to an entire continent under an empire, the script doesn't change. It just gets an accent and better stationery. So Kenya, 1950s, the Mau Mau uprising, anti-colonial fighters, British settlers, a state of emergency, and a detention system so brutal that for decades survivors kept saying, "They tortured us, they beat us, they castrated us, they worked us to death." And the official response from the British government? Essentially, unfortunate things may have happened, but there was no systematic policy of abuse. Translation: a few bad apples, nothing intentional, please go home. Here's the thing. That word systematic is doing Olympic-level gymnastics in these stories. Because once something is systematic, it stops being a PR problem and becomes a war crime problem. So for years, officials and their defenders in the community of respectable historians would nitpick. Where's the documentation? Where's the paper trail? Where's the memo that says, "Please torture more efficiently at 3 p.m. No paper, no policy, no responsibility. And for a long time, that worked. Survivors testified, journalists reported, scholars wrote about detention camps, forced labor, rehabilitation through beatings. But without the smoking gun files, it all got shoved into the contested allegations category. Maybe exaggerated, maybe isolated, maybe memory is unreliable. You know that move where fans argue a scene doesn't count as foreshadowing because the author never confirmed it was intentional? Same energy, just with human lives. Pattern interrupt. In 2011, some lawyers walked into court for a Mau Mau reparations case and basically forced the British state to admit it had a secret colonial file room, not a metaphor, a literal off-the-books archive at Hanslope Park, holding around 8,800 files from 37 colonies. Among them, detailed records from Kenya, reports of torture, castration, forced labor, systematic mistreatment in the camps. The exact "there's no proof" that survivors had been told didn't exist. These weren't misfiled. They were deliberately removed from Kenyan archives at independence and hidden in a special vault so future governments could say, with a straight face, "We have no evidence of widespread abuse." Listen to me. That is not ignorance. That is pre-writing the denial. You don't just stumble into a secret archive. You planned that twist. Once those files surfaced, the narrative flipped in record time. In 2013, the UK government expressed regret, agreed to pay around £20 million in compensation to over 5,000 Mau Mau survivors, and funded a memorial in Nairobi. Suddenly the story wasn't isolated incidents anymore. It was abhorrent violations of human dignity documented in their own handwriting. The evidence hadn't magically appeared. It had been sitting in a locked room while officials told the world there was nothing to see. I need you to clock the foreshadowing here for every future scandal. When an institution says, "There's no proof," that can mean, "We hid the proof so well we assumed you'd never find it." This is not a sin unique to one empire. This is normal for power that expects to outlive its victims. And if they can bury an entire colonial archive, what else can be edited, shredded, or quietly reclassified as national security before you ever get to read it? We need to sit with that before we talk about the wars you actually remember living through. If archives can vanish, budgets are even easier. You don't have to burn a ledger, you just change the story around it. And economic storytelling is where the world government really goes for the Oscar. You've heard the slogans your whole life. We all tightened our belts. There is no money. Bailouts are necessary to save the system. Inflation just happens. Short, folksy, delivered with that disappointed parent tone that makes you feel irresponsible for even asking where the trillions went. Here's the thing. These aren't neutral descriptions. These are moral scripts. When they say, we all tightened our belts, who is we? Because every time that line shows up, ordinary people get wage freezes, gutted services, and temporary cuts that mysteriously outlive entire governments. Meanwhile, the same year, banks get bailed out, corporations get tax holidays, and asset prices get rocket boosters from central banks. The story is, your school closing is a sad necessity. Their bailout is a brave, responsible decision. Same crisis, different category of human. I need you to notice the framing trick. There is no money never applies to war, to surveillance, to corporate subsidies, to emergency liquidity facilities with names that sound intentionally boring. It applies to healthcare, to housing, to student debt relief. The author of the budget is telling you which characters are allowed plot armor and which ones are disposable side NPCs. And this is intentional. The austerity narrative turns basic survival into a moral failing while presenting systemic rescue for the rich as technocratic realism. Then they add the illusion of choice. Multiple parties, big colours, very dramatic debates on TV. But zoom out and they all agree on the sacred pillars. Debt must always be repaid. Growth must always expand. Markets must always sit at the top of the food chain. You're watching a heated argument over whether the gun on the mantle should be polished weekly or monthly, not whether maybe we stop pointing it at everyone. The community is trained to treat the core assumptions as just how the world works, not as planned decisions someone benefits from. Crises are where this storytelling goes speedrun mode. 2008, pandemic, oil shocks, currency crashes, pick your season. Suddenly, the same politicians who spent a decade telling you there is no money discover infinite cash and zero legislative patience. Measures are temporary, exceptional, just until things stabilize. Capital controls, emergency lending windows, eviction moratoriums, quantitative easing. You blink and entire sections of the economy have been quietly rewritten while you're refreshing infection numbers or unemployment stats. And then, the crisis ends. The headline threat moves on, but the scaffolding stays. Surveillance laws don't sunset. Central banks keep the new tools. Labour protections expire on schedule. Corporate protections don't. This is not a sin unique to one ideology. This is normal for systems that discovered you can foreshadow permanent power grabs by wrapping them in emergency branding. We need to talk about what those temporary fixes actually did under the hood. Because in the next section, I'm going to pull receipts on specific post-crisis programs that never left and show you how they quietly rewired the entire global economy while everyone was arguing about who caused the fire. So here's the thing. Once you realize the emergency branding trick exists, you start seeing it everywhere, and it stops feeling random and starts feeling intentional. I need you to hold that thought, because the next pattern in the playbook is the temporary measure that never ever packs its bags and goes home. The structure is always the same. There's a crisis. Real, exaggerated, or manufactured doesn't matter. A controversial policy appears with an expiration date stamped on the box. This is not a coup. This is a trial period. This is not a new system. This is a patch. Foreshadowing for permanence is baked into the pitch, but they swear it's a limited time offer. And then the countdown hits 0, nothing explodes, and the exception quietly slides into the default settings. Take emergency banking guarantees. 2008 hits, the global financial system faceplants, and suddenly governments are backstopping everything that moves. We'll just do this until stability returns. Cool. Except the guarantees mutate into standing facilities, new regulations hardwired too big to fail into the story, and extraordinary central bank interventions, zero rates, quantitative easing, alphabet soup lending windows, become the new normal background radiation of the economy. The crisis ended on paper. The emergency tools stayed on the toolbar. Security is even worse. After terror attacks, you get temporary special powers, mass surveillance programs, warrantless access, secret courts. The Patriot Act is sold as a stopgap. We just need this now, or the bad guys win. Then Snowden drops PRISM and XKeyscore receipts, and you realize the temporary scaffolding has turned into a permanent panopticon. The sunset clauses, perpetually renewed, amended, rebranded. The building never goes away. They just repaint the lobby and tell you it's new. And the way they sell it is emotional blackmail. If we don't pass this bill, the markets collapse. If we don't extend this measure, there's another 9/11. If we don't give these powers, you personally are putting troops, nurses, children at risk. Opposition isn't just wrong, it's reckless, unpatriotic, morally suspect. Listen to me. When every debate is framed as do this or everything dies, you're not in a democracy. You're in a hostage negotiation with better lighting. Once people adapt, the trap closes. We get used to banks only surviving with central bank life support. We get used to airports as ritual humiliation zones, data collection as the price of entry to modern life. Rolling any of it back is framed as too disruptive. You can't unwind this without chaos. So the emergency becomes the baseline, and the baseline becomes invisible. This is fine. This is normal. Until you zoom out and realize the temporary staircase has been carrying policy upward for 20 years straight. And this loops us right back to narrative manufacturing. The core lie isn't always the policy itself. It's the supposed endpoint. The promise that this story arc has a clean resolution, that the author will put the toys back in the box when the crisis chapter ends. We need to ask, what if the toys were never going back? What if the expiration date was foreshadowing for the next grab, not the end of the current one? Because the moment you start checking which temporary measures actually expired, you stumble into the next nastier question, the one I'm going to walk you through in the next section, about what they're quietly building toward while you're still arguing about when the emergency ends. So once you notice that emergency powers don't really retire, they just change costumes, you run face first into the next illusion, the way they talk about your wallet. And listen to me, this is where the storytelling gets genuinely impressive, because they've managed to turn basic arithmetic into a supernatural horror movie. Inflation, in the official script, is this vague, spooky fog that just kind of rolls in one day. Mysterious forces, global headwinds, unexpected pressures. And then, right on cue, they point at you, at workers, at anyone who dared to ask for a raise after a decade of stagnant wages and say, well, what did you expect? Suddenly your rent doubled because you were greedy enough to want dental. Here's the thing, inflation is not a ghost. It is an outcome. It's the result of very intentional policy choices and very intentional corporate behavior. When central banks conjure trillions out of nowhere to prop up asset markets, that's not magic. That's money creation. When that money chases stocks, real estate, and corporate buybacks instead of your paycheck, we get asset bubbles on top and, sorry, times are tough, at the bottom. This is normal in their world. This is fine. But in the public narrative, the category they push hardest is personal responsibility. If prices are crushing you, the problem, apparently, is that you bought coffee. Not that your landlord just jacked rent 30% because every private equity fund on earth decided housing is their new casino. News segments will spend 10 minutes lecturing you on meal prep and 0 seconds on corporate pricing power. Pattern interrupt. Go back and read central bank statements during any inflation spike. I need you to notice the phrase they all use, cooling demand. Sounds clinical, neutral, scientific. In plain English, that means we are going to make you poorer until you stop bidding for basic goods. Higher interest rates, layoffs, wage suppression, those are not accidents. Those are the tools. Pain is the mechanism. And here's where the distributional foreshadowing kicks in. Because they're not cooling everyone's demand equally. Whose incomes are targeted? Workers, tenants, people on fixed salaries. Whose incomes are treated as sacred, almost natural law? Corporate profits, executive bonuses, asset holders. When inflation hits, suddenly wage growth is a problem, but record margins are just market dynamics. This is not a sin, they tell you. This is just how the economy works, except someone wrote it that way. An author sat down and planned this story. The whole live within your means sermon is a narrative device to hide the fact that someone else is living very comfortably on the spread between your shrinking paycheck and their expanding balance sheet. So next time prices spike and the community starts arguing about who ruined everything, I need you to pause. Ask, who are officials telling you to be angry at? Workers, unions, small tenants, excessive consumer demand? And who do they carefully avoid mentioning by name? Because the answer to that question is the bridge to the next lie on this list. Because here's the thing. Once you've blamed everyone except the people in charge, you still have one more problem if you're a government. You have to make sure the next generation never even knows what actually happened. I need you to understand this. The battle over what kids learn in school is the battle over which version of events becomes reality for everybody who comes after us. You remember your history textbook, right? The one that made entire genocides feel like a scheduling conflict. During this period, tensions rose and clashes occurred. Clashes. Not the state opened fire on unarmed protesters. Not security forces tortured dissidents. Just vague, passive, things happened energy. As if history were a weather report that accidentally rained bodies on a Thursday. Governments are obsessed with that wording. Wars become interventions. Coups become restoring order. Military juntas are transitional authorities. Internal repression, that's a period of instability. The verbs get laundered until no one is doing anything to anyone. There's no author of the violence, just a mysterious situation that unfortunately required tanks. Take war justifications. The Gulf of Tonkin incident that helped escalate Vietnam. For years, textbooks presented it as a straightforward attack on US ships. Clean, unambiguous, heroic response. Then NSA documents dripped out and whoops, turns out key claims were false or wildly exaggerated. But what gets fossilized for students? Not the messy debate, not the whistleblowers, the retrofit. The version polished after the damage is irreversible. Same pattern with Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. In real time, you had inspectors, experts, and journalists screaming that the evidence was flimsy, that intelligence was being fixed around the policy. But open a lot of school materials from the 2000s and you'll see something much softer. Intelligence indicated Iraq may have possessed WMDs, leading to a coalition intervention. May have. Led to. Intervention. The foreshadowing is gone. The lie becomes a tragic misunderstanding between well-meaning adults. And when the state commits atrocities, the language goes full witness protection program. The Tuskegee syphilis study. An unethical medical study that harmed participants. Harmed. By whom? Doing what? The UK's torture of Mau Mau detainees in Kenya. For decades, many students got violent clashes in the colony and allegations of abuse. Allegations, clashes, both sides. Suddenly the government is just one more guy in the bar fight. Listen to me. This is not a sin unique to one country. This is normal. This is how power tells its own story. The problem is that when you grow up on those summaries, the original controversy feels imaginary, conspiracy-brained, something only that one weird uncle on Facebook talks about. And here's the structural trick. Textbooks are always a few beats behind reality. They don't capture the live argument, the journalists getting sued, the historians digging through archives. They capture the settlement, the plea deal, the moment when officials have already negotiated which words are allowed on the page. Which is why, later in this video, we need to do something borderline illegal for your sanity. We're going to put those neat, bloodless textbook paragraphs side by side with the declassified memos, the internal cables, the do not distribute reports. And when you see what got edited out, you're going to realize the textbook wasn't the beginning of your education. It was the final draft of their lie. Because here's the thing. Those memos and cables didn't just magically diverge from the textbook on their own. There's a middleman in this story. There's a whole professional class whose job is supposedly to challenge power, and instead half the time they end up running tech support for the lie. I'm talking about mainstream journalism, the respectable stuff, the we have standards crowd. And I need you to understand how the dependency works, because if you miss this, the rest of the list just looks random instead of intentional. Reporters don't get scoops by manifesting them through sheer narrative foreshadowing. They get them from access, from press briefings, off-the-record coffees, background phone calls with someone who can't be named because of the sensitivity of the matter. You want to be the first person in the community to tweet the big story. You need those people. You need the press pass, the plane seat on the war junket, the invitation to the secure briefing where they walk you through the intelligence. So what happens? You learn very fast not to burn the author of your access. You quote the senior official, you repeat the talking point, you tell yourself you're being critical, but the entire frame of the story was already planned for you before you opened your laptop. This is where anonymous sources become a narrative laundering machine. Senior intelligence officials say, and suddenly an unverified claim has been promoted into a headline. No evidence on screen, no documents, just vibes and a chyron. But because it's dressed in that authoritative category label, it feels real. It feels intentional. And this is not a sin unique to one country. This is normal across empires. Remember the run-up to Iraq? WMDs could be deployed in 45 minutes. Mushroom clouds, mobile biolabs. Those phrases didn't fall from the sky. They were fed on background to reporters who then turned them into front-page inevitabilities. Years later, after the inspections, after the reports admitted the intelligence had been fixed around the policy, the corrections dripped out in sad, anemic paragraphs on page A17. Same pattern with the Gulf of Tonkin. Initial coverage. Unprovoked attacks. Grave threat. Urgent need to respond. Decades later, when the NSA quietly concedes the story was exaggerated and key claims were false, that gets a documentary, a declassified PDF, and a collective shrug. And the correction problem is brutal. Fear is front page. Nuance is footnote. The first story gets the push alert, the panel discussion, the dramatic B-roll of missiles in the night. The retraction gets a sentence, maybe two, once the emotional damage is already baked in. You remember the terror scare. You do not remember the follow-up where it turned out the plot was half entrapment and half fantasy. Listen to me. By the time the truth trickles out, the narrative has already done its job. The vote passed. The war started. The surveillance program got renewed. Most fans of the news never see the patch notes, which raises a worse question we need to stare at next. What happens when the government doesn't just nudge the coverage, but starts treating the entire information ecosystem as a battlefield? When you turn information into a battlefield, you also create an enemy, anyone who defects from your side. So we need to talk about the people the official story treats as traitors, lunatics, or both. Whistleblowers. Here's the thing. A whistleblower is not just someone who leaked stuff. That's the shallow, lazy category the news hands you. A real whistleblower is an insider who risks their career, their freedom, sometimes their life, to reveal wrongdoing the public has a right to know about. The key word there is intentional. The crime is not impulsive gossip. It's a planned act of dissent against an institution that controls the narrative. Generalization first. They exist in every domain where power hides its mess. Concrete example. Edward Snowden, sitting inside the NSA, watching mass surveillance programs vacuum up global communications while officials went on TV and did the "we don't collect that data" routine. The foreshadowing was all there. Vague warnings about privacy, weird legal memos. But until an insider walked out with documents, it was a conspiracy theory. Then there's Chelsea Manning, handing over war logs and footage that showed what surgical strikes actually looked like on the ground. Again, same pattern. The community was told the war was precise, humane, necessary. The documents said otherwise, and it's not just the headline names. Health and safety whistleblowers who warn that a drug trial is rigged or a water supply is contaminated. Financial analysts who expose banks cooking their books, selling garbage to clients while betting against them. These people are the accidental editors of the official story. They walk into the draft the government is publishing and go, "No, actually, here are the deleted scenes." Without them, half the lies in this video would still be dismissed as fringe speculation. So what do you do if you're the author of the official narrative and someone starts leaking your rough drafts? You don't argue the facts. You go after the character. Standard playbook. Question their motives, smear their mental health, call them narcissists, traitors, foreign agents. Focus on the theft of documents, not the content. You've seen this. The headline becomes, "Did Snowden endanger lives?" Not, "Did the government lie under oath about spying on everyone?" I need you to notice that distinction because it's not accidental, it's planned. Pattern interrupt. If whistleblower protections worked the way civics class promised, this section of the video would be boring. It would be a footnote. They spoke up, it got fixed, the end. This is not a sin. This is normal in healthy systems. But in reality, the laws that supposedly protect whistleblowers are narrow, full of loopholes, and selectively enforced, while espionage and secrecy laws get swung like a hammer. Snowden charged under the Espionage Act. Manning hit with decades in prison. Health workers fired, blacklisted, dragged through years of litigation. Listen to me. That asymmetry is the point. It's not a bug. It's a warning to the next person who thinks about speaking up. And once you see whistleblowers as the people who puncture the script, you start asking a worse question. What happens to the stories where no insider ever talks? Because those are the lies that never even make it to the conspiracy theory stage. So we need to do the boring, unsexy thing now. We need to stop collecting shocking anecdotes and actually name the pattern. Because once you see the pattern, you stop getting whiplash from every new scandal and start recognizing, oh, we've seen this episode before. Here's the thing. Across almost every major lie we've talked about, the choreography is the same. Step 1. Define a threat. Inflate it, dramatize it, wrap it in moral panic until your grandma is scared. Step 2. Demand exceptional powers. Emergency laws, blank checks, secret courts, whatever. Step 3. Deny or downplay abuses. Isolated incident. Within legal frameworks. No evidence of wrongdoing. Step 4. Attack critics and whistleblowers. Smear, prosecute, exile. Step 5. Retrofit the narrative later when the documents come out, and suddenly everyone in power always had concerns. Watch Gulf of Tonkin through that lens. First, the threat. Mysterious North Vietnamese attacks on noble American ships, sold to the public as unprovoked aggression. Then the exceptional power, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, effectively a war authorization without a declared war. When reports started conflicting, abuses and escalation were minimized. Questioning the story? Congratulations, you were soft on communism. Decades later, declassified NSA documents admit key claims were false or exaggerated, and the narrative gets quietly patched in textbooks so it feels inevitable instead of manufactured. Same skeleton, different skin when you hit Iraq's WMD's threat. Mushroom clouds, mobile biolabs. We don't want the smoking gun to be a smoking gun. Exceptional powers. Preemptive war. Patriot Act. Detention without trial. When no stockpiles appeared, the community was told it was an intelligence failure, not an intentional sales pitch. Dissenting experts were sidelined or painted as naive. Then, once the damage was irreversible, internal memos surface about intelligence being fixed around the policy, and suddenly the story is, well, everyone thought they had WMDs at the time. That's not a random oops. That's foreshadowing for the retrofit. Run the same pattern on mass surveillance. Threat. Vague but omnipresent terrorism, the ticking time bomb that never actually ticks on camera. Exceptional powers. Prism, X-Keyscore, Dragnet metadata. Public line. We don't collect data on ordinary citizens. which turned out to be a very creative sentence. Snowden leaks, and instead of, "Wow, we lied to you," the system goes straight to step 4. Attack the whistleblower, make the story about his personality. Years later, there's a soft narrative shift to necessary tools with some excesses, and everyone is supposed to move on. Public health scandals, same playbook. Tuskegee defines the threat as scientific ignorance, demands exceptional secrecy and control, denies abuses for 40 years, destroys critics, then retrofits the narrative into a cautionary tale about past ethics once it's undeniable. This is not a sin of one bad agency. This is normal for how power tells stories about itself. I need you to do the annoying homework here. Mentally run this 5-step script on events in your own country, in your own lifetime. War on drugs, financial crises, pandemic policies. Which step are you in right now? Because some of those narratives are still mid-season, and in the next sections we're going to apply this pattern to more recent events where the ending has not been written yet. Listen to me. Once you recognize the choreography while it's happening, you stop being the extra in someone else's propaganda and start reading the script as it's being drafted. So once you start reading the script in real time, you notice something worse than propaganda. You notice the schedule. Crises don't just happen and then governments react in a panic. Over and over, the reaction turns out to be a pre-written wish list that's been sitting in a drawer, waiting for the right fire alarm. Here's the thing. In storytelling terms, the crisis is the inciting incident, but the policies are Chekhov's gun. They were already on the mantle. The emergency is just the moment they finally pull the trigger and tell you, "Sorry, no time to debate. We have to do this now, or people die. We need to talk about receipts, because this isn't me being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. We have drafts. We have think tank PDFs. We have strategy memos that read less like cautious governance and more like fan fiction for control freaks." Example: years before the 2013 Snowden leaks, policy circles were already publishing cheerful essays about modernizing signals intelligence and leveraging commercial data at scale. That's surveillance. That's PRISM and X-Keyscore in polite, footnoted prose. The community was told mass collection was a paranoid fantasy. Then the documents dropped, and surprise, the architecture was not improvised in one anxious weekend after an attack. It was intentional, planned, and waiting for a justification. Same pattern with war. The Gulf of Tonkin attack that turbocharged Vietnam. Later, NSA documents admitted the public story was false or exaggerated. Iraq's WMDs. Internal reports admitted the intelligence was being fixed around the policy. The decision to invade came first. The mushroom cloud speeches were the marketing campaign. That's the crisis playbook. Step 1. Incubate your wish list in think tanks and closed-door meetings. Step 2. When something blows up, literally or metaphorically, slam that folder on the table and say, "Fortunately, we already have a solution. It looks responsive." It's actually pre-writing. Now, why does this work? Because the emotional environment of a crisis is engineered for consent, fear, confusion, information overload. You're doom scrolling, you're sleep deprived, the headlines are screaming in all caps. In that state, your brain is not doing careful line-by-line policy analysis. Your brain is doing, "Please, someone, make this stop." And when someone raises a hand and says, "Hold on, can we read the fine print?" The response is always the same. Now is not the time for politics. Opposition is framed as irresponsible, dangerous, even murderous. Questioning surveillance after a terror attack? You're helping the enemy. Questioning emergency health powers? You're killing grandma. Questioning sanctions or intervention? You hate freedom. This is not a sin in the moralizing sense. This is a tactic in the rhetorical sense. I need you to notice the next move in the pattern. Every extreme measure is sold as temporary. Sunset clauses, emergency authorizations. We'll roll it back when things calm down. This is fine. This is normal. In theory. In practice, those sunsets get extended. The temporary databases never get deleted. The troops don't fully come home. The new censorship tools linger in the back end of every platform, and once the community adjusts, the Overton window quietly locks in a new position. Yesterday's unthinkable becomes today's baseline, which raises the uncomfortable question we have to hit next. If the emergencies keep justifying the same direction of change, how many of those emergencies are being curated? So when you hear curated emergencies on repeat, there's a phrase that always shows up as the punchline: national security, the ultimate conversation ender, the narrative equivalent of flipping the table and walking out of the room. Here's the thing. For a term that gets used to justify everything from wars to redacted PDFs, it is almost never defined in any precise operational way. It can mean troop positions, sure, but it can also mean this ambassador said something stupid in an email, or this minister doesn't want voters to see how bad he is at math. The category is intentionally mushy, because a mushy category can stretch to fit whatever problem the government has this week. You see it every time someone tries to use freedom of information laws in a serious way. A journalist files a FOIA request, waits a year, gets back a document that looks less like text and more censored than a shonen manga in a church library. Ask for the unredacted version. Sorry, national security. Sue in court. The judge is told behind closed doors that disclosure would endanger the nation, and suddenly the case evaporates. Parliamentary committee asks for the same material. Same magic words. Different building, same brick wall. And then, 20 or 40 years later, the classified material gets declassified, and you finally see what was supposedly too dangerous for your fragile little citizen eyes. Gulf of Tonkin cables where the threat was exaggerated into a casus belli. Iraq WMD assessments where the intelligence was fixed around the policy. Colonial torture files in Kenya that were hidden not because they would reveal some cutting-edge spy technique, but because they would reveal war crimes. The operational secrets were almost always boring. The embarrassing lies were the radioactive part. This is not a sin unique to one country. This is not bad apples. This is normal in the sense that it is structurally baked into how modern states do storytelling about themselves. And the problem is that the other institutions that are supposed to push back mostly don't. Courts defer because they aren't experts in security. Media defer because they don't want to be accused of helping terrorists. Politicians defer because they plan to be the ones saying national security next term. Pattern interrupt. What if most of the time the thing being secured isn't the nation, it's the narrative? Listen to me. When questioning a security claim is treated as naive or dangerous or unpatriotic, you've just handed the author of the official story a blank check. Fans of the state are told to clap on command. Skeptics are told to sit down and shut up. And we need to notice the foreshadowing there, because it always points in the same direction. The paradox is brutal. The more secure the state becomes from public scrutiny, the less secure you become from its abuse. A government that can hide its mistakes behind a magic word can repeat them indefinitely. Which raises the next problem we have to talk about. What happens when that same logic is turned inward, and the target of all that secrecy isn't foreign enemies at all, but you and your data? And when the target becomes you and your data, there's one more obstacle they have to neutralize. Anyone who points at the pattern. Not the policy, not the memo, the pattern. So they don't just hide information, they pre-poison the image of the person who notices it. You know the stereotype, the conspiracy theorist. Unkempt, alone in a dim basement, walls covered in newspaper clippings and red string, ranting about lizards and numerology while a CRT TV hums in the background. No friends, no job, just vibes, and vibes are unhinged. This is not an accident. This is not a random meme evolution. This is a socially constructed character class, and it's been patched into the culture for decades. Here's the thing. Once that caricature exists, it becomes a weaponized shortcut. You don't have to engage with the argument anymore. You just have to gesture at the category. Question the Gulf of Tonkin story when it was happening. You're one of those guys. Ask why the "we know where the WMDs are" speech turned out to be vapor. Must be you're connecting random dots. Pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast and CIA in your cereal. The facts become secondary to the vibe of the person mentioning them, and the vibe is carefully curated. Late-night shows run the same gag on loop. Tinfoil hat, bug eyes, Pepe Sylvia whiteboard. Sitcoms have the one weird guy at the office who does his own research and ruins parties. Memes do the rest, compressing an entire category of questioning into a single image you're trained to cringe at before you even read the caption. I need you to notice how efficient that is. It's narrative control outsourced to the community itself. Because once the community internalizes that cringe, the real work is done. You don't need a censor if everyone is terrified of being seen as that guy. You hesitate before you mention that Snowden's paranoid claims about mass surveillance turned out to be Prism and X-Keyscore in black and white. You edit out the part where you compare Tuskegee or Mau Mau torture cover-ups to current events because someone will say you're going full conspiracy. This is fine, you tell yourself. This is normal. I'll just keep it to myself. That self-censorship is the point. The goal isn't to convince you that every official story is true. The goal is to make publicly doubting it socially expensive. You start doing little mental PR for your own thoughts. Is this a reasonable question, or am I about to get lumped in with flat earth and lizard queens? And because there really are unhinged theories out there, they get used as the reference image for everything. Guilt by proximity. So we need to say this out loud. The stigma around conspiracy theorists is itself part of the storytelling. If you can't safely attack the facts, you attack the kind of person who asks for them. You turn skepticism into a fashion crime. And once you've done that, you can move to the next level of control. Not just who talks, but what they're allowed to see in the first place. Which is where your feed, your search results, and your "for your safety" labels quietly enter the chat. And here's where this gets uncomfortable, because it's not just their algorithm that's rigged, Your brain is running its own propaganda feed in the background, and it is ruthless. There's a name for this: confirmation bias. The tendency to go hunting for information that proves you right and quietly mute anything that suggests you might be wrong. If your core belief is governments are mostly honest, you will cling to every press conference, every expert on TV, every trust the institution slogan as proof. If your core belief is everything is a false flag, you will scroll past 1,000 boring documented scandals and stop on the one unverified thread with red string and ominous music. Same bias, different costume. Here's the thing. Confirmation bias doesn't care what team you're on. It only cares that you stay on it. When the US and UK sold the Iraq WMD story, a lot of the community that already believed our side doesn't do aggressive wars saw that claim as automatic foreshadowing of noble intentions. When the NSA said, "We don't spy on Americans," fans of the security state heard reassurance, not a hedge. It took Snowden dropping actual documents for some people to even consider they'd been narrating a fantasy. But we need to go one level deeper, because it's not just what you believe, it's how your hardware works. Your brain is a pattern-seeking monkey that sees Jesus in toast. That's not an insult. This is normal. This is not a sin. It's the same hardware that lets you understand foreshadowing in a story, or spot a twist coming 3 episodes early. It's why you can connect Gulf of Tonkin was misrepresented to Iraq WMD intelligence was fixed around the policy, and feel, correctly, that there's a recurring pattern of war lies. The problem is when that very useful pattern detector starts speedrunning. 2 events share a date, must be coordinated. A policy in one country vaguely resembles a policy somewhere else. Clearly a single mastermind author writing the whole planet. A random power outage the same week a leak drops. Obviously an intentional cover-up. Or it was a squirrel and a bad transformer. Both exist in the same category of possibility. Pareidolia is the technical term for seeing faces in clouds or a saint in a water stain. In politics, pareidolia is when every coincidence becomes a secret operation. Every bureaucratic screw-up becomes a 12D chess move. You see a memo about national security, a glitch in a voting machine, and a trending hashtag, and suddenly you've written an entire season of prestige conspiracy television in your head. No budget, no evidence, incredible storytelling. I need you to understand. The solution is not stop seeing patterns. That would make you easier to fool, not harder. The solution is to demand receipts before you promote a pattern to plot, documents, timelines, corroboration. If someone says, "This is just Tuskegee 2.0, I want to see the protocols, the funding trail, the whistleblower, not just a spooky vibe and a zoomed-in screenshot." So from here on, treat the rest of this video as disciplined pattern recognition. I'm only connecting dots that are actually connected on paper. Declassified files, sworn testimony, internal emails, the boring stuff. And once you see how many of those dots already form a picture without any extra lines, you're gonna start asking a much scarier question about the one pattern almost no one talks about. So here's where we need to slow down before we all turn into that pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast and a CIA plot in every toaster crumb. If I'm going to say the government lied here, I need you to know exactly what category that's in. A confirmed lie is not a vibe. A confirmed lie is paperwork. It's when an official statement gets directly contradicted by something with legal or institutional teeth. Declassified files, court findings, commissions, sworn testimony, or straight-up admissions from the people who did it. We were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin in a clear, unprovoked way, versus later NSA documents saying, actually, no, that second attack didn't happen. That's receipts. Iraq has active WMD programs versus the inspections and reports that found nothing, plus memos saying the intelligence was being fixed around the policy. Again, receipts. Here's the thing. That bar is high on purpose. It has to be. Because once you're in confirmed lie territory, you're not just arguing on YouTube. You're in the same evidentiary universe as historians and judges. Tuskegee isn't a rumour because we have internal memos, medical records, and official apologies. Mass surveillance isn't a theory because Snowden dropped program names, slide decks, and legal authorizations. The UK torturing Mau Mau detainees stopped being alleged abuses the moment the secret colonial files surfaced and a court case forced compensation. Contrast that with the weaker stuff. Anonymous source says there's a secret clause. A friend of a friend swears their uncle saw a classified memo. A policy just feels off, so it must hide a false flag. This is not a sin. Suspicion is normal. Pattern recognition is normal. Saying, "This smells weird, I'm going to watch it," is fine. The problem is when the community quietly slides that from plausible suspicion into settled fact, without the boring paper trail catching up. So practically, I need you to build a reflex. Where is the primary source? Not the quote card on social media, not the outrage thread summarizing a summary of a blog. I mean the declassified file, the hearing transcript, the original memo, the court ruling. If you can't, at minimum, point to a document, a recording, or sworn testimony, you are not in documented lie territory yet. You are in interest in theory or YouTuber with a red string wall territory. Quick pattern interrupt. Sometimes the government didn't lie. Sometimes we just learn new information later. That matters. Timelines are everything. Did the evidence contradicting the statement exist when they said it, or did it emerge years later? If a minister in 1950 says, "We don't know X," and the relevant science only appears in 1970, that's not foreshadowing of a cover-up. That's just history moving on. By the end of this video, I want you able to point at any claim and calmly sort it into 3 boxes. This is a documented lie, this is a plausible suspicion, or this is probably nonsense, and know why. Because once you can do that on your own, the next set of war lies and temporary measures I'm about to walk you through stops being a horror story and starts being a pattern you can actually defend in public. So here's where this stops being a history lesson and turns into a live experiment you're stuck in. We did the Snowden arc, we did the leaks, the denials, the we would never era. Then we watched the hard pivot into, okay, yes, but it's narrowly targeted, heavily overseen, and if we don't do it, the terrorists win. Cool. That was Season 1 and Season 2 of the surveillance story. I need you to ask, what season are we in now? Because listen to me, we are not in the denial phase anymore. Nobody serious goes on TV and says, "We don't collect data." That's dead. Instead, the narrative is, of course we collect data. Everyone does. The question is whether we do it responsibly. Hear the foreshadowing there? The move isn't to hide the gun. It's to keep telling you there's a really trustworthy safety on the trigger. And also, by the way, They might need a few more guns for emerging threats. Here's the thing. Every new proposal is framed as a reluctant, tragic necessity. Expanded data access for online harms, encryption backdoors to stop child abuse material, AI-driven monitoring to catch foreign influence operations. The category is always something no sane person wants to defend. You're not voting on mass surveillance, you're voting on whether you hate children. This is not a sin unique to one country. This is standard issue narrative control. And the story beats are weirdly consistent. First, we're falling behind the bad guys. Our laws are from the fax machine era. Then, we've designed a narrow, targeted, totally intentional tool. Then, don't worry, there's rigorous oversight. Except when you actually read the fine print, the oversight is usually a secret court you're not allowed to see. A parliamentary committee that can't talk about what it learns, or an internal audit that publishes a 3-page summary with half the nouns missing. Notice what almost never shows up in those debates. The previous lies. The pre-Snowden denial. The we don't do bulk collection statements that aged about as well as a 2003 WMD press conference. It's treated as a fresh trust account every time. No overdraft fees. No. Given that we misled you for a decade, here's why you should believe us now. The community memory is reset, and new promises spawn on a blank slate, as if the author just started a new chapter and we all agreed not to reference the earlier drafts. We need to start treating live policy coverage the way we treated those declassified documents. Watch for the 5-move pattern in real time. When a minister says, "This is a temporary, exceptional power," mentally tag it as setup. When a tech CEO announces a public-private partnership to scan content with AI, ask which category of threat they're anchoring it to. When they reassure you that independent experts have signed off, check how independent and from whom. Because the next section, we're going to zoom in on specific new laws and partnerships and walk through them beat by beat. And I want you seeing the script before they finish the sentence. So when you hear new laws and partnerships around speech or security, I need you to remember the last time the script ran at full speed, the recent health crises. You already feel your blood pressure spike when I say that, right? This is one of the most emotionally loaded, politically radioactive topics on the planet, which is exactly why we need to walk through it very, very carefully. Here's the thing. I'm not here to refight your least favorite argument thread from 2020. I'm not grading your personal decisions. I'm looking at process, how the story was told, how the author of the crisis narrative handled foreshadowing, revisions, and retrofits. Because once you watch the writing, you stop getting hypnotized by the plot. Remember how guidance started? No need for masks. Full stop. Then, actually, masks are essential. Then, 2 masks. Then, cloth masks don't really work. You need this other category. The problem isn't that guidance changed. In a real emergency, this is normal. The problem is how the uncertainty was framed. Early on, when they already knew supply was an issue, they didn't say, "We're not sure yet, and we need to save these for hospitals." They said, with total confidence, "You don't need this." That's not science evolving. That's narrative management. And when treatments or origins were still giant question marks, how often did you hear, "We genuinely don't know yet, and here are the competing hypotheses"? Instead, you got sound bites delivered with courtroom certainty, then quietly walked back months later. No evidence of X. Then, Well, there is some evidence of X. Then, we've always said the situation was evolving. That's a retrofit. This is not a sin in itself. Revising is fine. But pretending you never spoke in absolutes is straight up gaslighting. Listen to me. Dissenting experts were not all fringe cranks broadcasting from a basement bunker with a tinfoil hat Wi-Fi booster. Some were credentialed, published, and very boring on paper. Yet, when they raised specific technical objections, dosage, trial design, cost benefit for kids, they got folded into the same bucket as the virus is fake people. Questioning a policy became rhetorically the same as denying the crisis existed at all. That move is intentional storytelling. Merge every critic into one cartoon villain so you never have to answer nuanced questions. You saw threat framing everywhere. If we don't do X, millions will die on one side. If we do X, civilization collapses on the other. You saw temporary measures, emergency powers, travel restrictions, mandates, sold as short-term pain, then renewed, extended, or repackaged. You saw public-private partnerships around data and content moderation justified as one-off necessities, then quietly normalized. This is fine in the sense that emergencies are messy. This is not fine in the sense that the tools never really go back in the box. And once you notice that the same narrative devices from war, surveillance and censorship got copy-pasted onto health, threat inflation, overconfident assurances, retroactive edits, you start asking a very rude question. If this is how they tell the story when the threat is real, what does it look when the threat is negotiable? Because the next temporary program I'm about to show you doesn't even have a virus to blame. Because the next temporary program I'm about to show you doesn't even have a virus to blame. It has a spreadsheet. It has a press conference. It has a very serious man telling you, with dead eyes and a PowerPoint, that we had no choice. Think about the last big financial crisis you lived through. 2008, the Eurozone mess, the pandemic crash. Pick your poison. The story you were handed was almost copy-pasted. Unforeseeable shock. Totally random. A black swan swooping in from nowhere, so we need immediate, massive intervention to save the economy. Not help specific people. Save the economy, this abstract dragon that apparently lives in bank balance sheets and has to be fed trillions, or it dies. Here's the thing. When they say save the economy, watch who gets the life raft first. In 2008, it was the big banks and the insurance giants. During the pandemic, it was major corporations tapping credit facilities before you even finished doom-scrolling the headlines. The rescue was planned, targeted, precise. The chaos was for you. You got told to be patient, to be resilient, to tighten your belt while they airdropped cash on the exact institutions that had been joyriding the system into a wall. And the structural problems that made the crash inevitable. Regulatory capture, where the referees are on the payroll of the players. Exotic financial products that were basically casino chips with better branding. Decades of wage stagnation and inequality so bad that one missed paycheck was a boss battle. Those got pushed into the background in favor of the no one could have seen this coming narrative. The community of experts who absolutely did see it coming. Relegated to footnotes or treated as pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in every candlestick chart. This is not a sin unique to one country. This is normal in modern economic storytelling. You frame the event as an asteroid strike, not the final very intentional consequence of policy choices and lobbying. Because if it's an asteroid, there are no authors. No planned arcs, no accountability, just fate. And then, once markets stabilize, very specific markets held by very specific people, notice what happens. The promises of serious reform, of never again, quietly fade. The hearings get boring, the reports gather dust. But the emergency tools, the special lending windows, the backdoor guarantees, the legal precedents for bailouts on demand, those stay. They move from one-time exception to permanent option in the background menu. Pattern interrupt. I need you to stop and ask a rude question. When they say, "We had no choice," whose choices are they talking about? Because there were always other options on the table for you. Debt relief, direct cash to households, nationalizing failed institutions, even letting some giants actually fall. Those were framed as impossible, irresponsible, unthinkable. Not because they were unworkable, but because they helped the wrong category of people. We need to start treating "we had no choice" as a confession, not a justification. A confession that the only choices that counted were the ones that protected existing power. And once you see that in the economic rescue story, you start wondering where else the no choice script is quietly running in the background. So when you start hearing "we had no choice" everywhere, the temptation is to swing all the way to the other extreme and go, okay, so there's a perfectly coordinated global puppet master pulling every string. And listen to me. I get why that story is satisfying. It's clean. It's cinematic. It turns the mess into a single villain you can point at. Here's the thing. That story is also a lie. It's just a flattering lie in the opposite direction. It assumes a level of competence, pre-planning, and intentional foreshadowing that most governments demonstrably do not have. You've seen the same people who can't fix a pothole supposedly orchestrating a 4D chess narrative across 50 countries and 3 generations. Really? Think about the Gulf of Tonkin. The official story was polished enough to sell a war. But the actual record is a mess of misread radar, panicked reports, and then, yes, opportunistic officials who realized, oh, this confusion is useful. The lie worked not because it was elegant, but because fans of the flag were busy, scared, and had no access to the raw signals intelligence. Sloppy input, confident output, same with mass surveillance. For years the line was, "We don't spy on ordinary citizens." Then Snowden drops PRISM and X-Keyscore, and suddenly the "we" turns out to be 10 agencies tripping over each other's databases. The problem wasn't omniscience. The problem was a sprawling, barely coordinated machine that still managed to chew through your privacy while losing its own PowerPoints. This is important, because if you assume omnipotence, you start to assume inevitability. If there's a single flawless author behind every policy, then resistance feels pointless. Why bother fighting the zoning board when you've decided the real script is being written in an underground Bilderberg writer's room? That fatalism is a gift to the people who actually are abusing power in small, boring, fixable ways. I need you to notice how incompetence and malice can sit in the same chair. The Tuskegee experiment was cruel on purpose. It was also run by people who screwed up records, lost track of patients, and improvised procedures. Evil does not mean efficient. Coordinated does not mean smart. Our pattern-seeking monkey brain sees Jesus in toast and then assumes the toaster is a god. And this is not a sin. Wanting the story to have a mastermind is normal. It's the same instinct that makes a fandom overcredit an author for foreshadowing every coincidence. But when we overcredit competence, we stop looking at incentives and structures. We stop asking, what rules keep producing the same lie in different countries? And retreat into, well, the cabal decided. What I'm arguing in this whole video is simpler and honestly, scarier. You do not need an omniscient villain when you have repeatable incentives. You do not need a secret room when the open plan office rewards the same narrative over and over. And that brings us to how those narratives actually get manufactured in the first place. And when you zoom out and see that machinery running on autopilot, it does something to your brain. It's not just an interesting pattern in the abstract. It's your trust account getting drained in real time. So listen to me. If you've been watching this and feeling your stomach drop with every example, that is not you being weak. That is your threat detection system doing its job. Powerless, angry, tempted to just tap out and go, whatever, everything's fake. I'm going to touch grass and never read the news again. This is normal. The problem is, if you stay in that state, you become extremely easy to manage. A quiet, exhausted fan is the dream audience for bad storytelling and bad governance. Here's the thing. Your brain needs categories. If you treat every rumor, every leak, every anonymous thread as equally real, you will melt. So we need some mental boundaries. First category, things you can actually verify. Documents, declassified archives, court cases, budgets, stuff with receipts, Gulf of Tonkin memos, Snowden slides, Tuskegee timelines. Second category, things you can reasonably suspect. Patterns that repeat, incentives that rhyme, stories that keep foreshadowing the same outcomes. Third category, unknown for now. Not true, not false, just parked. This is not a sin. This is fine. You are allowed to defer judgment. When you do that, you stop being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast every time a minister coughs. You become more of an author in your own head, deciding which plot threads are actually intentional and which are just noise. Skepticism turns into a discipline, not a personality trait. It's a habit of checking, not a permanent state of being furious on the internet. I need you to also zoom your sense of agency down to a scale where your actions have visible effects. You are not going to personally dismantle the surveillance state before lunch, but you can harden your personal data hygiene. You can stop handing your entire social graph to every shiny app. You can help your local community library run a media literacy workshop so the next generation of fans can tell the difference between propaganda and reporting. You can show up to a boring zoning meeting where the rigged part of the economy is quietly being written. And remember, the only reason we even know about half the lies in this video is because some very annoying people refuse to shut up. Whistleblowers leaked. Journalists sued. Historians dug through boxes in basements. Communities amplified them. The author of the official story is not the only one holding the pen. The fact that the Tuskegee study ended, that Iraq WMDs are now a punchline, that Mau Mau torture was acknowledged at all, that's proof that slow, grinding change is possible. Which raises a harder question. If you don't want to be a passive character in this story, how do you actually push back on the script while it's being written? So here's where this stops being a history lesson and starts being homework. If the author of the official story isn't the only one holding the pen, then I need you to actually pick up yours. You need a BS detector, not a tinfoil hat, a toolkit. Start with 3 stupidly simple questions. Question 1, what's the evidence? Not, they said it at a podium. actual verifiable stuff. Documents, data, names, timelines. When they sold the Gulf of Tonkin story, you got dramatic speeches and grainy radar blips. Decades later, the NSA quietly admitted key parts were exaggerated or just wrong. Question 2. Who benefits if I believe this? War budgets, surveillance powers, approval ratings. Follow the upgrade. Question 3. What's the worst case if it's false? Because marching into Iraq on WMD foreshadowing that never pays off is a different category of mistake than misjudging tomorrow's weather. Here's the thing. You're not trying to become a human lie detector. You're trying to become a really annoying editor. Every time a big claim drops, new war, new emergency power, new temporary surveillance program, you pause and run those 3 checks. Evidence, beneficiary, worst case. You won't always get a clean answer. This is fine. The point is to interrupt the auto-accept reflex the propaganda machine is banking on. Second tool. Compare the script across time. Governments are terrible serial writers. They forget what they wrote in chapter 3. We need to get petty about continuity errors. What did they say last month versus now, and what changed in between? When mass surveillance was exposed by Snowden, the narrative went from "we don't do that" to "okay, we do that but only for terrorists" to "actually it's legal and for your safety in record time." That shift is not random. It's storytelling under pressure. Watch the revisions. Pattern interrupt. Stop doom-scrolling headlines. Headlines are trailers. They're cut to sell tickets, not accuracy. Read the second paragraph, then the 5th. Check if experts say has any names attached or if it's just a vibe. If there's no credential, no institution, no paper, that's not expertise. That's a fog machine. Whenever you can, go to primary sources, declassified memos, official reports, actual data tables. Yes, it's boring. I am a pattern-seeking monkey who would rather see Jesus in toast than read a 300-page PDF, but that's where the bodies are buried. Next piece. Build a personal lie library, literally a notes app folder called They Lied, Tuskegee, Mau Mau torture, WMDs. The temporary measures that never ended. This is not a sin. This is not obsessive. This is normal defensive driving for your brain. When a fresh narrative drops that smells structurally identical to an old one in your library, you don't have to scream conspiracy. You just downgrade trust and upgrade verification and understand the goal. You will be fooled. I will be fooled. This is normal. The win condition isn't perfection. It's shortening the half-life of your gullibility. Getting fooled less often for shorter periods with smaller stakes. In the next section, we're going to zoom out one more level and talk about what you actually do once your BS detector starts lighting up. Because spotting the pattern and deciding how to respond are 2 very different skills. So here's where a lot of people in this community swerve straight into a wall. You realize you've been lied to, your BS detector finally turns on, and instead of calibrating it, you just set it to "everything is fake forever." I get it. I did the same thing. For about 2 years, my worldview was basically a teenager's Tumblr feed with extra footnotes. But here's the thing. Healthy skepticism and self-destructive cynicism are 2 different categories of response. Skepticism is you acting as your own editor. You demand evidence. You ask, who benefits? You update your beliefs when new facts emerge, even if that means admitting you were wrong. You accept that some questions sit in the unproven folder for a while. This is not a sin. This is how grown-up storytelling about the real world works. Cynicism is the speedrun version. Cynicism says every author of every event is evil, every institution is irredeemable, every official statement is automatically the opposite of the truth. No nuance, no gradations, just pure binary. If a court orders disclosures on a surveillance program, controlled op. If a whistleblower leaks documents, scripted. If a reform passes, foreshadowing for a worse thing. You reject any possibility that something was partially honest or accidentally constrained by public pressure. Listen to me. Governments love that version of you. They benefit from the guy who thinks every election is 100% rigged in every direction, because that guy never organizes, never sues, never files FOIA requests, never shows up. If you're convinced the story is already written and your pages don't matter, you stop editing the script. That's not rebellion. That's passive cooperation with the worst-case scenario. Now, contrast that with what actually happened in some of the biggest lies. The Gulf of Tonkin narrative that helped justify Vietnam. Decades later, NSA documents admitted key claims were false or exaggerated. That wasn't a gift. That was the result of researchers, lawsuits, and declassification fights dragging receipts into the light. The Iraq WMD story. Inspectors, journalists, and inquiries forced the phrase "fixed around the policy" into the historical record. Snowden didn't just post memes, he detonated proof of programs like PRISM and X-Keyscore and triggered real legal challenges. Those outcomes are messy and incomplete. This is fine. The point is not the system works. The point is pressure works sometimes, and sometimes is infinitely better than never. If you erase those wins because they don't feel cinematic enough, you're doing propaganda cleanup for free. So where do we land? In the uncomfortable middle. I need you to trust no one blindly, including me, including your favorite commentators who tell the story you already want to hear. We need to hold two ideas at once. Institutions lie a lot, and yet constrained, angry, coordinated humans can still force disclosures, reforms, or at least admissions of wrongdoing. In the next section, we're going to get painfully practical and talk about what acting from that middle actually looks like, how you investigate, share, and push without turning into either a doomer prophet or a government PR intern with extra steps. So here's where I need you to zoom out with me for a second, because this is the part almost everyone in the community whiffs. If you hear everything we've covered so far, and your first instinct is, "Wow, this proves my side was right," you've already lost the plot. Here's the thing, the lies we just walked through did not belong to one colour on a campaign poster. Gulf of Tonkin, different era, different branding than the people who sold you WMDs in Iraq. Mass surveillance. You had governments swearing up and down they'd never spy on innocent citizens. Then a whole different crew inherits PRISM and X-Keyscore and quietly keeps the machine humming. The author changed. The story stayed the same. War powers creep, emergency powers, temporary surveillance authorities that mysteriously never sunset. These are not partisan plot twists. They're recurring motifs in the writing of power itself. One team dramatizes it as protecting freedom, the other as defending democracy. But the foreshadowing is identical. There's always a manufactured threat, always a moral panic, always a promise it's just this once. Then, 20 years later, you're still taking your shoes off at the airport and your phone is a pocket informant. Partisan framing trains you to see only half the pattern. When the other team lies, it's corruption. When your team lies, it's complicated, or context, or we had to because national security. This is not a sin exclusive to dumb people. This is normal. Your brain wants to protect its identity, so it does this adorable pattern-seeking monkey thing where it spots government propaganda instantly. But only when the logo in the corner isn't your favorite. And that's the problem. If your outrage turns off the second your jersey color wins, you're not actually against lying. You're against losing. You're not demanding honest storytelling. You're demanding that your preferred author gets to control the narrative Bible. Look at the cross-partisan habits. War powers expand under one leader, then the supposed opposition gets in and not only keeps them, but sometimes upgrades the DLC corporate bailouts. Different slogans, same upward wealth transfer. One side calls it stabilizing markets, the other calls it saving jobs, and somehow the people who crash the economy walk away with bonuses while you get a means-tested coupon. So we need to stop treating this as a left/right drama and start reading it as a systemic genre. The category here isn't my politicians versus your politicians. It's institutions with concentrated power versus everyone who has to live with their plot twists. The standard can't be, do I like the speech? The standard has to be, can they show receipts? Is there transparency? Is there any accountability when the story turns out to be fabricated? Listen to me. If you only demand evidence when you're already suspicious, you're doing reactive media criticism, not actual oversight. The entire point of this list is to show you that the foreshadowing for the next lie is already on the mantelpiece, regardless of who's in office. The only question is whether you're going to notice it before the next temporary measure becomes permanent. And in the next section, I'm going to ask you to do something that will make both your favorite pundit and your least favorite uncle deeply uncomfortable. So here's the uncomfortable thing I need you to do next. You have to rewrite the social contract, but only in your head. Not with a revolution, not with a manifesto, just with a different default assumption about what's going on when a podium appears and a flag is in the background. Right now, most people run on the hallmark setting. Governments are honest, with rare tragic exceptions where someone went too far. We treat Gulf of Tonkin or Iraq has WMDs as glitches, bugs in an otherwise functional program. But listen to me, the pattern we just walked through, that's not a bug list. That's the feature set. So here's the thing. You need to flip the model. Assume spin, self-protection, and narrative control are the baseline, with brief, reluctant bursts of candor when they're cornered by leaks, whistleblowers, or declassified documents. The Snowden files. The NSA quietly admitting Tonkin was misrepresented. The UK suddenly discovering colonial torture archives in 2013. That's not them growing a conscience. That's them losing plausible deniability. What does that change in practice? It changes how you consume news. Instead of asking, is this true? You start with, what are they trying to make me feel, and what are they carefully not mentioning? You hear, temporary emergency surveillance, and your brain immediately pulls up the pattern. Prism, X key score, every temporary measure that somehow retired with a full pension. You watch a press conference on inflation or debt, and you're not just listening to the words. You're tracing incentives, donors, election cycles, who benefits if the community panics, and who benefits if the community stays sedated. Pattern interrupt. This does not mean you go full Everything is fake, nothing is real, I only trust that one guy with a webcam and a whiteboard. That's just flipping to a different propaganda channel. The new social contract in your head is simpler. Official statements are one data point. Not the gospel, not the default truth, not automatically lies. One data point among documents, history, independent reporting, and your own pattern-seeking monkey brain that sees Jesus in toast and also occasionally sees an actual pattern. And this is not a sin. This is not you becoming paranoid or broken. This is normal adult information hygiene. When an author does foreshadowing, you don't assume every panel is a secret code, but you also don't assume nothing matters. You read with intent. Same here. You treat every briefing, every trust the experts slogan as part of a larger piece of storytelling with planned beats, test-marketed language, and a very clear target audience, you. Counterintuitively, this mindset lowers anxiety. When the next war justification falls apart, or the next surveillance program gets unexpectedly exposed, you're not spiritually concussed. It fits the category you already built. Of course there was a memo. Of course there was a cover story. Of course the apology is narrower than the original claim. And here's where we need to zoom out. Because this isn't just self-care. A population with calibrated expectations is harder to steer. One person asking, "What's missing from this story?" is annoying. 10 million people asking that at the same time is a structural problem. In the next section, we're going to talk about what happens when that private recalibration turns into public leverage and what governments have historically done to stop that from ever congealing. So now that we've dragged this whole thing out into the sun, we need to actually zoom out and see the picture. Not the individual scandals, not the spicy anecdotes, the pattern, the playbook, the part they're betting you'll never connect. Here's the thing. Almost every entry on this insane list fell into one of three categories. First, manufactured narratives. That's your Iraq has WMDs moment. The threat is mostly constructed on paper, but it's sold as gospel, and suddenly you've got a war. Second, operational cover-ups. That's Gulf of Tonkin. That's mass surveillance pre-Snowden. That's we would never spy on our own citizens, while PRISM is quietly hoovering your emails. Third, narrative retrofits. That's when the story gets rewritten decades later. Tuskegee morphing from medical study into, okay, yes, we deliberately withheld treatment, or colonial torture going from isolated incidents to, oh right, systematic policy, once the secret files leak. Those aren't random buckets. They're stages in a single piece of storytelling. And across all of them, the same 5-move pattern shows up so consistently, it may as well have a theme song. Move 1. Define a threat. There's always a ticking bomb. Communists, terrorists, viruses, economic collapse. Move 2. Demand power. Emergency laws, new agencies, expanded surveillance, temporary measures that mysteriously never sunset. Move 3. Deny abuse. We don't torture. We don't collect that data. We would never experiment on our own citizens. You've heard the script. Move 4. Attack critics. Whistleblowers are traitors. Journalists are irresponsible. Protesters are radicals. If you question the plot, you're written in as the villain. And then move 5. The endgame. Rewrite history. Classify, redact, stall, and then when the documents finally surface, quietly release a report that says, mistakes were made, in passive voice, with no main character attached. The story gets patched, so it still flatters the institution. Listen to me. You don't need a single cigar-chomping mastermind stroking a cat in a volcano lair for this to work. You just need the same incentives repeating. Officials rewarded for short-term wins, punished for admitting failure, operating inside systems with weak accountability and strong PR. This is not a sin unique to one country or one party. This is normal bureaucratic self-preservation, scaled up until it warps reality. And that's why this list matters. It's not a trivia night flex. It's not fun facts that will ruin your faith in humanity. It's a diagnostic tool. Once you've seen define threat, demand power, deny, attack, rewrite across war, surveillance, public health, and the economy, you start to recognize the foreshadowing when they roll it out again. You hear a brand new crisis speech and your brain, that pattern-seeking monkey that sees Jesus in toast, goes, "Okay, which move is this? I need you to actually use that. Not just nod, not just comment, crazy stuff, and let autoplay feed you a cat compilation." The whole point of walking through this exhausting catalogue of nonsense was so that the next time a government press conference drops, you're not just asking, "Is this true?" You're asking, "Where does this fit in the playbook and what's missing from the story?" Because from here on, the responsibility shifts. They're going to keep running the same script. The question is whether the community watching it has learned to read it. In the next section, we're going to talk about what it actually looks to turn that private pattern recognition into public leverage, and what happens when enough fans of reality refuse to stick to the official canon. So here's where this stops being a fun law video about geopolitics and starts being a mirror. Because once you've seen the pattern, the question isn't how could they anymore? It's what do you do now that you know? And listen to me, doing nothing is still a move. It's just the move they're betting on. We need to start stupidly small, personally small. The next time you see some viral thread about a secret biolab or a leaked memo, I need you to pause before you slam that share button. Ask, who's the author here? Do they show their work? Is there a document, a date, a scan, a source you can actually open? Or is it just vibes and a grainy screenshot of a screenshot? You don't have to become a one-person intelligence agency. You just have to stop being unpaid PR for whoever yells first. Here's the thing. You already know what government foreshadowing looks like. Temporary surveillance after a terror attack that never sunsets. Emergency powers during a pandemic that somehow stick around. The problem isn't that you can't spot it. The problem is that we treat every new example as a shocking twist instead of a planned beat in the same tired story. So your first intentional action is boring. Only amplify receipts. Prioritize outlets and researchers who link primary documents, who admit uncertainty, who correct themselves in public. That's your minimum viable resistance. Then you scale it to your actual life. Not a vague, everything is corrupt, wake up sheeple rant at Thanksgiving that makes your aunt mute the group chat. I mean uncomfortable, specific conversations. Hey, remember when they swore the Gulf of Tonkin attack was clear and unprovoked? Here's the declassified NSA report admitting it wasn't. That's why I'm side-eyeing this new imminent threat story. Or, they told people Iraq had active WMDs. Then the official inquiry literally said the intelligence was fixed around the policy. So no, I'm not crazy for wanting sources this time. Concrete lie, concrete document, concrete consequence. You're not a prophet. You're a nerd with citations. This is fine. This is normal. On the civic side, There are actual buttons you can press that aren't just post harder. Support transparency and freedom of information laws in your country. Those boring acronyms are how the Tuskegee files and the Mau Mau torture archives crawled into daylight. Back whistleblower protections, so the next Snowden doesn't have to choose between exile and prison just to tell you your own government is spying on you. Pay for independent journalism when you can, or at least boost watchdog organizations that drag buried reports into the light. None of this feels heroic. It feels administrative, that's the point, because systems do not U-turn, they erode. Every FOIA request, every leak, every local reporter who refuses to let a war lie get memory hold is another chip in the armor. Every person who refuses to forget that temporary measure, number 17, never went away, is quiet pressure on the author of the next script. One refusal is nothing. 10 million refusals is a new genre of storytelling. And since this is a community now, I want to weaponize the comments section. Turn it into a living archive. Post the biggest documented lie your government told that almost nobody outside your country knows about. War, surveillance, economic myth, whatever. With at least one source. Because in the next section, we're going to take that archive and push it one step further into something most governments really do not want fans of reality to figure out how to do. So here's where you stop being a viewer and start being a problem for the people who wrote these scripts. I need you to scroll down and turn the comments into the part of the archive I can't build on my own. Tell me the biggest government lie or cover-up from your country that most outsiders have never even heard of. Not the greatest hits everyone already knows. The weird regional scandal, the banned book, the "oh yeah, our military accidentally tested gas on our own citizens in the 70s" tier of story. Name it, give the short version, and if you can, drop at least one source. Because when you do that, you're not just venting. You're doing intentional, documented storytelling that future fans of reality can actually use. Here's the thing. The pattern only really pops when you zoom out across borders and decades. Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, WMDs in Iraq, secret torture sites, mass surveillance programs they swore didn't exist until Snowden dropped the receipts. On their own, each one is a mistake. Together, they're foreshadowing. They're the author's notes for the next emergency law, the next temporary measure that mysteriously never expires. So I need you to do two things. First, comment your example so the rest of us can see how the same story gets reskinned in different countries. Second, send this video to the one person in your life who still says, "Come on, they would never do that." Not as an attack, not as a "you idiot, wake up." Send it as, "Hey, here are the receipts. If I'm a pattern-seeking monkey seeing Jesus in toast, tell me which parts of the toast are wrong." If they're honest, the argument stops being, "This never happens," and turns into "okay, but this time it's different," which is at least a more accurate category of problem. And if you want to stick around for more of this, you know what to do. Subscribe, hit whatever button they're using this month, or just keep me in a tab somewhere. This channel is not for shallow outrage or blind trust. This is for slow, receipt-heavy breakdowns where we separate coincidence from plan, PR from policy, and propaganda from the boring, ugly memos underneath. This is fine. This is normal. We need to build a community that treats narrative control the way manga fans treat foreshadowing, frame by frame, panel by panel, no free passes. Listen to me. You are not crazy for noticing the pattern. You'd be crazy to see Gulf of Tonkin, Tuskegee, WMDs, mass surveillance, economic myths, health experiments, and still think the official story is where your thinking should stop. When we started, this was just a messy, overwhelming list of lies. Now it's a map. They spent a century drawing it, and somehow you're the one holding it. What you do with it next is the part they forgot to write.